Okay, everyone, we are live.
Okay, welcome to the San Ramon Valley Unified School District Board of Education workshop. We want to let the public know that we are video recording today's session. The recording is being live streamed on the district's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording has been posted to the district's website. I'd like to introduce my board members: Vice President Ken Mintz, Clerk Rachel Hurd.
Hello.
Member Laura Bratt.
Hi.
And member Shelley Clark.
Hello.
Hi, and I'm your president, Susanna Ordway. Right now, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, and report of actions taken in closed session. There was no report and no action taken in today's closed session. So we're going to move to our agenda approval for today's workshop. May I have a motion to accept the agenda?
So moved.
Second. Okay. And then Cindy.
The motion was made by Member Clark, seconded by Board Member Hurd. Roll call vote. Board Member Clark?
Aye.
Board Member Bratt?
Aye.
Board Member Hurd?
Aye.
Board Member Mintz?
Aye.
Member Ordway?
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Great, thank you, Cindy. Okay, going to 7.1, Strategic Direction Workshop, Part 2. So let's see, Dr. Malloy.
Thank you, President Ordway. And as we bring the presentation up, to our board and to our community who is joining us for the Part 2 of our Strategic Direction Board Workshop. It's really, I think, an important opportunity for us to communicate where we've been historically, where we are presently, and most importantly is for you to give us some of your initial insights as well as some direction related to our stakeholder engagement that will be starting right after we finish this workshop today. So the next slide continues to align our purpose. We're sharing the important information about our process. We're thinking about the evolving needs of today's learners. We are focusing so very importantly on social emotional well-being within our district. And we're also thinking about learning and innovation, deep learning and innovation. And I want to start by saying that we already know that we have a district where our kids reach many of the standards. Not necessarily all of our kids, but the majority of our kids. And last week in our equity session, we talked a little bit about how we ensure the conditions are there for all students. But we do exceptionally well with the standards that in the state of California in terms of our graduation rates and such. But this question is, so what does it mean to take it to the next level? Even if that next level is not measured by some of the standards that we're already used to. It still means that we will meet those standards and then some more. And so that's what our discussion is today. Next slide. So we'll review the process and about the needs. We took your advice. We're no longer calling them pillars. It's components. We're talking about components and we'll explain that and the implications for our future work as well as giving you some time to provide us some insight. So let's first go to the review of the strategic planning process, and I'll be brief because you saw this last week. Again, I'm just repeating it quickly so that we're all starting from the same place. The system collaboratively creates and communicates the district plan, and then the schools create their goals and strategies based upon this plan and their local context. And the reason that I share this with you again is because I think it is so very important for us to continue to emphasize. Our students are in classrooms in schools. All of our work focuses at the classroom level and at the school level. And district direction provides the parameters we're working in, aligns the resources that are required, provides the monitoring and oversight necessary, ensures the learning that needs to happen for these goals to be met. But the real place of improvement is in the classroom and in our schools. And those 36 campuses are not obviously the same. Those district directions that we are working on have to provide enough of that focus, but in such a way that still allows for that local contextual creativity to take place. Next slide, you will see what we put forward before you before. I would like to say it again. We did the initial needs assessment that landed in the priorities that we've been talking about, and that was 2 board meetings ago. We're now in the phase regarding input from you. We move to stakeholder engagement. We bring that stakeholder engagement perspective back to you, number 4. And then, of course, we move right into the development then of the plan in June that gives our schools the opportunity to do work in the fall. Our timeline at this point is the same as you saw, which is obviously part 1 of our workshop last week, part 2 this week, our stakeholder engagement, the revisions, the bringing back that stakeholder engagement, then of course the actual strategic plan process. Hopefully by the end of June, we have clarity regarding the direction we're heading. And again, I think it's important for me to reiterate that it is significant to engage our public, our community, our stakeholders, our students as well, of course, as one of our stakeholders in this discussion. But having been involved in strategic planning work for many years, I do believe that the very focused timelines, though a challenge on one hand, are actually a benefit on another, because this has to be about the commitments we're making, the direction we're heading in, the rationale for those commitments and that direction. And though we will need to do some word creation, we have to put this into a plan. This is less a wordsmithing exercise and more of a commitment exercise. And I'm hoping that over the next 3 months, that becomes very clear. So the components on the next that you are aware of based upon board report is equity, which is so very foundational, deep learning and innovation, and social emotional well-being. And in this presentation, we will share with you why we use the term well-being, for example. That's not necessarily a term that everyone has used previously. Social emotional learning, a term we all use, is actually part of that, and we will explain it. And of course, I already provided an introduction to why are we talking about deep learning and innovation when we're already exceptionally effective in so many ways. Well, there's always room to improve without ever losing the standards and those high expectations that we all already have. Next slide. And this is where we've tried to take the concept of the components and make it really clear that they're not isolated entities. You really shared that with us at the last workshop, and you're seeing that insight in this slide. So for example, when we focus on each student and their learning and their well-being, there is no learning and well-being, in my experience, for all students without that commitment to equity. The creating of the conditions that help all kids succeed, the removing of the barriers and obstacles to that success, the challenging of any bias or systems that might need to be challenged in order for those conditions to exist. Social emotional well-being, that sense of purpose, connection, belonging, that sense of self, that healthy sense of self in relationship with others that allows us to be strong human beings, is so much a key to our ability to take risks, to try new things, to challenge ourselves, which real learning demands. So I'm hoping as we walk through this portion of our workshop, these intersections become clear, that though we want to create some significant commitments in the areas of equity, social emotional well-being, and deep learning, we're always focusing on the student, the whole child, and not just an aspect of our kids. The foundational comment at the bottom is the importance of leadership. And as we are sharing these perspectives with you today, when I use the concept shared leadership, it's because each and every one of us brings our expertise and experience to the table. And formal leaders, principals, a superintendent, assistant principals, directors, we have a very significant challenge to do everything, not to lead everything, and not even to be in front of everything, though oftentimes our roles demand it. But what's important is that we unleash, support, enhance, invite that shared leadership that all of us possess, that innate experience and expertise that each one has. And then we have to be accountable. So the formal leaders need to be accountable. So the whole concept of leadership development is really foundational to the ideas that we are sharing with you. Next slide. So we are committed to nurturing a shared leadership model, to empower individuals to engage in school improvement work. And if it's simply the principal's job, in my experience, it wouldn't happen. Doesn't mean great things aren't happening in classrooms, but when we're talking about that strategic way forward, it truly is all of us. So if we look to our next slide, I want to go a little bit deeper into today's learner, tomorrow's learner, and the evolving needs. Next slide. We know this. The world we live in and work in is fundamentally different from the one in which parents and teachers, all educators, let me be clear, all our staff members have grown up. I mean, this is a quote. I just added to the quote, but I think it's important to be inclusive. Our world is so vastly different. And most recently, I was in a workshop where they spoke about how it used to take years, even decades, for information and for our experience to change so quickly. But now it's down to 12 and 13 months that we're seeing rapid innovations that impact our daily lives. And so whenever we think about learning, we simply have to do that in the context of what it is that our world is, which is fast moving in so many ways. When we think about the changing work environment, it's interconnected, it's interdependent. When we talk about economic opportunities, our students will need capacities that include, it's so important for me to emphasize, include and go beyond the subject areas of reading, math, science, and social studies. In that same workshop that I just alluded to, the presenters focused almost completely on the concept of transfer and application. That when we're talking about ensuring our students are ready for the world that is and will be, transferring what we've learned in so many different ways and applying those concepts in really profound ways is where it is that we need to continue our focus. And truthfully, the disruption that this pandemic has caused has revealed so much to us about where we have some strengths, where we have limitations, and of course, where we have opportunities. I'm going to go a little further into these concepts very briefly, just so that we all are speaking from the same page, and the next slide will assist. So when we think about organizational structures, hierarchy has been around forever, and yet we know the concept of team is so important. Being effective teammates is very different than being an effective member of a hierarchical structure. When we think about teams and projects, historically, or even in today, teams form slowly over time, or they stay together over time. Whereas now what we're seeing is groups come to specific purposes. They may disband, they may stay for a while, they shift, but it's much more fluid. The whole concept around flexibility and space, my job, my role, my assignment, being thought of in a certain way. But it's all in many cases become very different now, where we have the blending of roles and responsibilities. We may be asked to collaborate on multiple projects, those that are explicitly in our job description and those that may actually be beyond it. And we are doing both of these things, both today and the future, in sometimes the same piece of work. And as you can see, we're much less about job titles and much more about the expertise that we bring. So again, offering this particular information from Burson Deloitte Consulting just because it connects to research and evidence from other places. I think that this is information that you and our community is already aware of. But the challenging question is, because I do believe that everything I just said is something our community is well aware of, yet when you look at some of our structures in education, we have to ask ourselves the tough question, is what we're doing leading our kids to the type of experiences that we're talking about in a slide like this? Next slide. College and career readiness is so very important, but you see the word and I'm going to focus on and for a minute, because it truly is, in our experience, all about college and career readiness and much more. Civic literacy and engagement means that our kids contribute, serve, transform our community. Contributing to the common good. It's not just about individual success, it's about collective success as well. That connects very much to the social emotional well-being pieces. Reflection on and engagement in terms of what's going on in our society, where we need to focus and why, and how we're all going to make our voice heard in ways that bring about positive change. Technology use as a connector and an amplifier that leads to a sense of, I've contributed beyond myself, I've made a difference, I've provided service that has helped others, is truly something that the research is very clear about. Adds to that sense of purpose and belonging that each of us as human beings require. And becoming a change agent, when we can see the impacts of our efforts, again, the evidence suggests that that is truly very fulfilling and adds to that social emotional well-being again that I've spoken about. So it is about the preparation, college and career ready. And what we're trying to say is it's about all of this. Next, please. So I hope that when we go through this, the insights from this presentation, you'll know that we're building it on the current successes. We do have strong foundations in core academic subjects in San Ramon Valley. We do have high graduation in college rate. We do have high standardized test scores, AP honor roll, et cetera, and we have no intention of doing anything but continuing to improve there. And as we look at what we've just talked about, what more can we do in terms of social emotional well-being? And you're going to see data today that, at least when I saw it, really made me stop and wonder. We're going to talk about the global competencies and that deep learning required to gain those competencies, that and slide that you just heard me discuss. So if I turn to the next slide, I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for your thoughts. What do we want for our graduates? And how do you believe we should build on our successes in terms of preparing all students? And as I said, your opportunity to really dig deeply into this will be in May after we hear from the stakeholders. But I think it's important, before we jump right into the presentations, we have a lot more to share with you, but that we take a little time to hear from you regarding what you see, what you think based upon what you heard me share. What do we want for our students? And how do we build on the successes that have always been here, or at least for a very long time? President Ordway, I'll turn it back to you to facilitate that part of the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Malloy. And yeah, no, it's you know, all the points and the study, you know, model organization, organization models from Deloitte and everything else. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from actually the higher ed area and what and companies, businesses, what they're asking, right, for in terms of students who are coming into the workforce and stuff. So I'm gonna go ahead and let everyone. Do you have any questions or ideas for what we want to see? Okay, Laura.
I have a couple of thoughts. So I think that in terms of outcomes, you know, for our graduates, really developing that the skill set around learning, loving to learn, knowing how to learn, so that you become, we're giving our students the skills to be lifelong learners and to look at the world in that way, as opposed to just it being a check off the box, get an A and I'm done, learn the fact and move on. More about, you know, taking that, but then extending that to actually having that joy in learning. And then with that, also looking beyond the wonderful academic achievement that our students have and looking to a sense of academic fulfillment, so that there is that, you know, just that sense of I'm learning and I'm enjoying and I'm loving, and I'm not just learning to achieve, I'm learning to be better, to make the world better, to grow, you know. So kind of just extending that philosophy into fulfillment, I think, just from a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Laura said. Basically, you know, to have our students to have growth mindsets, right? This idea of growth mind, and not just being stuck and say, all I need to do is learn this and I'm good, and not being open, because that's actually part of, right, as a learner, is to explore, it's to be open, it's to be, and when you do that, you actually gain more and different types of skills that you might not think you need. But then once you have it, you know, or practice it, it actually opens doors to more opportunities.
I think all of our students are different, and I think what is successful or works for one may not work for others. And I hope that we can accomplish for our graduates that they can acquire what's success for them, not just in their academic pursuits for sure, but being a global citizen, being open to, as Susanna said and Laura alluded to, being open and being willing to learn, but that we give them the tools that they need for their own personal growth in whatever area that is. And also that we are able to instill in them the ability to move forward in their life when, you know, the support that from their parents and from the school district that they come from are not there anymore, and they're out in the world. And I think success is different for each person. And if we can supply the tools for each of our students to become successful in those ways, I think that's where we need to focus.
Other comments? Ken?
Yeah, building on what Shelley was just saying, I think there is a responsibility that we have to give our students a sense of self-responsibility. And we've started that with our personal learning initiatives, where more and more choice is placed on the student and their parents, that we've created options for them, as opposed to just giving them a structure that says, okay, this is the path you follow and you're going to graduate. Instead, they have to make more decisions on their own. I think built into that is responsibility for students to recognize the need for flexibility in themselves and their futures because of the changing environment. So the things that we teach them today are going to meet a number of their needs, but not all of them, because the world, as we've seen even this past year, is changing significantly. One of the key foundation areas that as Dr. Malloy's one pyramid chart showed, we have a lot of strengths. One of the things that I've pointed out to folks in the past, and I think holds true going forward, is the skill set or toolkit that our kids leave our school district with. In addition to the academics, and we talked about things like civic responsibilities, what we've always referred to as 5 C's, beginning with critical thinking skills, but collaboration, curiosity, communication skills, foundational skills that no matter what they're doing, and as Shelley said, they're all different, but there's certain foundational skills that for our students to be successful going forward, things that we should feel as a school district, we've given them the opportunity to build. So no matter what hits them in the future, they have a basis for success.
Rachel.
I agree with what everyone has already said and just would like to build or add one more kind of idea to that. In that goal of preparing every student to be a contributing and fulfilled member of society, the global citizen Shelley referred to, I think we also need to recognize that it's a continuum in their growth. You don't start right off with the littlest ones with, okay, you're going to do the highest level of deep thinking and creating new things. We have to invest along the way in the foundational skills for all so that they can do that. We can't just leave out the bottom 10%, 20% who have trouble with that. It may take them longer. And so it's the end game for everyone that's important, and the inputs are going to be different for every child, but we have to recognize the appropriate developmental continuum for young minds that turn into grown-up minds.
Okay. Any other comments or ideas?
So why don't we for that, and we will continue on now, focusing more specifically on the component of social emotional well-being.
Good afternoon, everyone, trustees and the San Ramon Valley Unified Community. My name is Jessica Colson, and I am the coordinator of social and emotional learning and college and career readiness for the district. Next slide, please. So Dr. Malloy spoke earlier about social emotional well-being and how that is more than just social emotional learning. It encompasses the whole child, as he discussed. It is the belief that students' basic needs and emotions must be taken care of to allow for optimal learning conditions and to allow for students to thrive and grow into responsible, ethical, and productive citizens. So I'm going to take a minute to give a little bit of science here. I want to talk about cognitive load, and cognitive load is the theory that your brain has a capacity to manage information. And if there are competing factors like stress or anxiety or distraction, it reduces the amount of capacity your brain has to process, synthesize, and retain information. So especially in light of today's climate, with everything happening, the anniversary of the pandemic, it is so much more important to be able to come into our classrooms, to come into our homes, and to meet the people we engage with in a very calm, very smooth manner so that they can engage in learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to sort of engage our parasympathetic nervous system and bring us down back to our baseline after we've engaged in a stressful event. And many of us do these things already. So I'd like you to hold up your hand, fingers spread out. This is a 5-finger breathing activity. It's incredibly simple. It's very low stress. And if you are so comfortable, you can go ahead and close your eyes. We're going to inhale as we trace our finger up and exhale as we trace our finger down. So take your other hand and inhale up and exhale down. And inhale up again and exhale down. Inhale up and exhale. Inhale and exhale. One more time, up and exhale. Okay, thank you. So basically, that is an act of self-regulation that as adults we have learned. We all have different coping skills. If we're frustrated, if we're stressed, we might go on a walk. We might give ourselves a timeout and count to 10 before we re-engage in the conversation that has upset us. With our students, with our children, they don't yet have some of these skills and some of these coping mechanisms. So it is incumbent upon us to engage with them in regulation relationship where we demonstrate positive developmental relationships and teach them these skills. One of which is empathy. Next slide, please. So this is an example of an activity that we can do for ourselves, that teachers can do in their classes. And I'd like you to take a minute just to look at statements and see where you are, yes or no. And you might be a maybe, or you might be a sometimes. But I want you to think about, do you often think about other people's feelings? Yes or no? I don't make fun of other people because I can imagine what it feels like to be in their shoes. I listen to others about what they're going through. I try to understand other people's point of view. I am aware that not everyone reacts to situations the same way I do. So this is a quick little survey that's taken from Teaching Tolerance. And what it does is it explicitly gives statements about empathy so that we can learn how to relate to other people and walk just a few steps in their shoes. If a teacher were giving this in their classroom, I might ask them to have students write down one thing that they want to work on, either moving from the no to the yes, or even the no to the sometimes category. Have them write it on something and revisit it in a week or two to see what progress they have made with regard to this. Next slide, please. So as we talked about, social emotional well-being encompasses everything that supports students. But there are two distinctly different categories that these terms often get tossed around and sometimes interchanged, but they're different, they're intertwined. With regard to mental health and mental health supports, that is a person's emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It impacts how we feel, think, and act, and it affects how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Social emotional learning is when students acquire and apply the knowledge and skills, develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals. Later on in this presentation, we will talk about CASEL and the 5 competencies used throughout social emotional learning. But we cannot have mental health supports without addressing social emotional learning and support the two together under the umbrella of social emotional well-being. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Amy Capro, who's going to go into more depth about this and talk about some of the data.
Amy, we can't hear you for some reason. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay. Hello, I'm Amy Capro. I'm the Assistant Director of Special Education. Good afternoon, Board Trustees, community, and Dr. Malloy. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about social emotional well-being, which is one of my favorite topics. Here is a list of some of the supports we have for social emotional well-being in San Ramon. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the supports. So we have our wellness centers at 2 of our high schools, and we're in the process of expanding those to Monte Vista and San Ramon Valley. We have our feeder worker social workers. We have school counseling intervention program, which is a partnership with Discovery Counseling Center. And also our school counselors and our school psychologists support students in many different ways as well. But what this doesn't encompass is all of the things that are happening in our district around social emotional well-being, the things that are happening in our classrooms where teachers are engaging in mindfulness activities with students, or engaging in community building and relationship activities, or the way teachers infuse social emotional well-being when they teach a challenging concept to students and when they give them the support to reach to master the concept that they're learning and to master a skill. And that in and of itself, that supports social emotional learning. When our students are taught well, they get the support they need, and they master a concept or skill, that increases their social emotional learning and their being. I was recently in a meeting where there was a team and they were problem solving with a student about some concerns she had at school. And one of the things that the teacher asked is, what would you prefer? How would you like me to handle? And anytime we can give them choice and give them a chance to share their voice in support of their social emotional well-being. Next slide. Additionally, we have 2 district support teams that help school sites and support students. So first we have our district crisis intervention team, and that team provides crisis support at school sites as is needed. There are multiple teams that get activated if there is a crisis at a school site and there's a need. What I really appreciate about this team is every single psychologist, social worker, and counselor participate on this team. So they are all in teams, and when a crisis happens, people from all different school sites go to that school site to help support them and to support those students and staff. We also have an amazing suicide prevention committee, and this committee is also made up of counselors, social workers, psychologists, and site administrators. They provide professional development around suicide prevention. They have made recommendations around presentations and curriculum for suicide prevention with our students and our parents, and they help develop and update structures for risk assessments. And one of the things this team had to do this year is really look at how that's different when we're virtual and what that looks like and how we make sure we're supporting our students, even though they're not in the classrooms with us. They also connect and provide an enormous amount of resources for our district, for families and for students to connect for students that are in a crisis. Next slide. But before we go any further and I start to talk about some additional information, we wanted to ask you, based on your knowledge and experience with our community, what do you think students need from a social emotional standpoint?
I have some comments. This is an area that is really near and dear to my heart and is such important work. I started working in 2017 at San Ramon Valley High School to address some of the around social emotional learning. And we started with one of the programs called Challenge Success. And one of the things that we learned through the survey that we did with the kids at the high school, which we had a pretty high rate of kids that participated, were some key issues that maybe we weren't aware of at that time that came to light around sleep, around social groups, around extracurricular activities, around family pressure, around academic pressure. And it was very telling. So I think this has got to be something that we all do together, because we've made great strides in the last few years, but there's still a lot more to be done. And I think it's going to take all of our teachers with professional development, and it's going to take the special programs that we bring in, like Challenge Success, like Teaching Tolerance, like No Place for Hate, because this is about creating a culture, making a little bit of a culture shift for our students to know that where they can be, how they can be supported, where they need to go to get support, and that we keep this in the forefront as we teach the academic subjects that we teach, and we have such high standards for that we make this of equal importance, because without their mental health being taken care of, without them feeling supported, it's very hard for them to be successful. So I think it's going to take all of us and some concrete plans around where we go from here. And it sounds like you have a really great start.
Laura?
I think that, so prior to COVID, there were, in the years coming up to COVID, there were, it was very clear that our students of this generation have a higher burden, I think, when it comes to all of the information being brought to them, and the pressures and various things, just as the world has shifted. And so that's created an elevation in a need for emotional and social support, wellness support. And then with COVID, I think it's really, it's exploded, if you will, right? I know that's kind of extreme, but in talking with various people, it's clear, and seeing in my own household, it's clear that for those students, and really for all of us, that are, kind of just able to cope in a way that you're working at it. And then with the burden of COVID and all the anxiety around that, that's just kind of brought many of us over the edge. And so from a student perspective, a lot of students who, were managing and dealing with the pressures, now they're having a much harder time. And so when we step out of COVID and back into so-called normalcy, I think there's going to be a lot of work that's going to have to be done to help support and mend the heartache and the anxiety and the collateral damage, if you will, of COVID, of the constant transitional shifts that have happened with education for our students. As much as we've done the best that we can to support and to create as much consistency as possible, we know, having lived and continuing to live through a pandemic, that there's so much out of our control. And so now what do we do as we're coming out of that to really support all of the students so that they can heal and they can learn more skills around coping. So really acknowledging that, and then doing what we can to fully engage and support those students. And then I think from a kind of a pre-COVID world, there's a lot of anxiety for our older students, our secondary students, when it comes to achievement. And I see in our wonderful high school counselors, they're amazing, and they do so, and middle school counselors as well. But I think specifically with high school counselors, they're looked at from a student perspective, I think at times, as an academic counselor, but they're also a social and emotional counselor. And so I think we need to look at that, those roles, and how, from a student perspective, how it can perhaps be difficult for them to see them as emotional support when they also see them as academic support. And when, with that pressure around academics, it's just, I think, and I believe with the wellness centers at the high school that does go a long way, and kind of splitting that a little bit for students, so that there is that person that only focuses on social and emotional wellness, that those students can feel comfortable going to that person, knowing that they're not going to see a poster of, what are you going to do for college, or where are you, how are your grades, on the wall, right? Where it really is just focuses on their emotions. But anyway, but just, being aware of that there are those categories. And I think oftentimes our counselors have to juggle and balance all of that at once with the students, and making sure that there's space for those thoughts and those feelings in each arena, a space for them to talk about them in a safe place. So, and then another little thing is just the idea of, for the elementary school age kids, the having some kind of leadership counselor type of position. Maybe it floats, I think from a budget standpoint, having a counselor at each elementary school maybe isn't the right answer, but having, and maybe that this exists and I'm just not aware of it, but having that kind of leadership role that's not reliant solely on the assistant principal or the principal, so that it can be, again, a person who it can really focus on social and emotional wellness, and not have to be that person that kind of the student sees as academic and emotion. So
Ken.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking through as I'm hearing the plans as well as the conversation. And one of the things that hits me as we as we continue to build this transition from, as Laura was saying, academic counseling to more wellness counseling, and not just through our counselors, but also through our psychologists and our social workers, is we're moving into an area that historically would not have been considered part of the educational scope. You know, we've always tried to take care of our students. However, it was always on the basis of their learning, you know, the 3 R's. And as we move more into social emotional well-being, and we scope our role there, I think we have to keep in mind how much falls outside of the educational environment that affects our students, and particularly their families. And, you know, whether there's more that we ought to be, and I'm not sure if we do or not, but we need to take into account how much of the behaviors and the stresses that affect our students and their learning comes from outside of the academic environment. You know, there's the peer pressure and all, but as we know, particularly for our high academic achievement kids, a lot of the emotion and stress comes from the family as well, with high expectations. And I just wonder how much we need to also, if we're going to be serious about their well-being, we need to identify programs that either we or in conjunction with others in the community provide to families to help support the students, not just within the school environment, but in their daily lives. You know, in other communities, you know, we'd be talking much more about wraparound services. You know, it's the student who doesn't have breakfast, who doesn't have, you know, a meal and dinner, and may just be lunchtime, that type of a thing. I'm not suggesting at all that we're going to be getting into more and more social services. However, as we attack something like social emotional well-being, I think we need to make sure that we're taking into account the full effect on our students, and what other players need to be involved in the kinds of direction that we're going from a strategic perspective. And placing that, as I mentioned, kind of, we have to scope out where our role is, and particularly as we look at what can we truly financially support in terms of this wellness effort as well, to do the best we can for our students.
Rachel?
Building on all of that, I think a differentiation that the presentation put out, I think, is a really important point, that this isn't just something that you support when there's a void or a hole or something's broken. The idea of it being social emotional learning, it's well-being, it's a preventative thing as well. And hopefully done right, becomes a way of life, and you don't have as many kids being pushed and pushed and pushed and then breaking and having to fix that. So kind of keeping all of this, the learning, academic learning, but just the learning to be a good human and the good citizen piece that we were talking about earlier has these 2 components in it all the way through. So you're learning healthy skills, coping skills, how to watch out for your friends' skills, and how to watch out for yourself. And then when you need help, this is where you can go. But I think there's really strong benefit in the investment of building healthy social emotional skills, rather than just focusing on services for when you need them. Because I think a lot of times one of the things our especially our teenagers struggle with is there's this immense pressure to perform. And then when they get to a point where they can't, you know, then you're over here and you're sheltered. And then how do you get back to the other? And it's really about balance and knowing yourself. And Ken, I think you're right. There's a huge community and family component to it, which isn't non-existent. I mean, we have a lot of the community already focused there, families focused there, PTA focused there. But it really kind of comes back to what Jessica was saying in the beginning about the whole child and these different aspects to it.
Yeah, and I like to add to both Rachel and what Rachel and Ken said. Everyone's touched on really important points, but it is right. That's why we're a board of education and we're not board of academics. Education to me is more than academics, right? It has to be everything so that that child or student is healthy enough in order to move on. And again, not just now, we want them to succeed even after they leave us, right? In college or in career or military, wherever they're going for their future. And I think that, like Ken was saying, yeah, we need to kind of look at how we can support, again, it's more of a community thing because more and more, right, we have a lot of families who come from different educational structures and countries and stuff like that who don't operate the same way that we do. And so how do we kind of support the student when maybe the family don't understand and is thinking one way for an education system, and the students kind of caught in between, like how we deliver our services, but what the expectation from the family is. So yeah, a lot to think about there.
And I have a comment on that
Sure.
I want to, and that is that what we found when we did the survey, and Ken is right, there's a huge family component to this that we can't control. But the two things that I think that we did and that were effective were through the survey, after all of those results were in and we had time to kind of assimilate some of that, we shared it with the parent community. And there were questions in there about the pressures that the kids feel from their families. And when, as a parent, you see that even though you think you're being supportive and productive by pushing your child maybe to achieve, and of course, everyone wants their child to achieve their best and their highest goals. When you see, for me, especially, I'll just speak for myself, when I saw that my pushing my son was actually causing him to have more challenges in his success and mental health, it gave me pause. So I think sharing that information and educating parents about the effects of that kind of pressure can have on their child is important. The second piece of it is that while we can't control what parents say to their kids or how they, and nor do we want to, when you give kids, students another perspective, when you present them with information from outside that validates their feelings and gives them a different perspective about what success is, it has a powerful effect. It may not change or take care of all of the issues they're having or all of the pressure they're feeling, but if what they're getting at home is more about, succeed and do your best and do this and do that, and they're feeling pressure because of that, giving them another perspective through a program like Challenge Success, it doesn't have to be that, it can be anything that shows them that the definition of success is much more than just what you achieve in your academics. Not that that's not important and that we want to keep those standards. Then it gets in their mind, and I think it gives them another place to go rather than just succumb to all of the pressures around, whether it's family or school or peer pressure. So that's why those kinds of programs on an ongoing basis are so important, because it can't just be a one-time thing. It's got to be creating a culture where they can feel successful.
Yeah, and I think to that point and to what Susanna said about culturally sometimes and oftentimes in our communities and specifically in Doherty Valley, there are families who have experienced not a completely, but a different type of educational style, and their children are then put into our educational style. And so they're stuck, they're kind of stuck between two worlds. And so so the example of maybe sometimes in a culture, because of a lived experience, you can't make a mistake. You have to do everything right because there's specific tracks that you go. And if you make a mistake, then you lose out on something. Whereas culturally, I think for the way I was brought up was that I can make mistakes and I can learn from them and I can do whatever I want and I can be whoever I want to be. And if that doesn't happen until I'm 40, that's okay. And if I choose something, to go to a certain college and major in something, I can change it and I can do all of those things. So at a school site, we're telling our students that they can make mistakes and they can do all of this, but then they go home and maybe they're feeling like they can't make mistakes. And so how do we, as a public school district, as a supportive educational institution, how do we value the culture that they're living in and the lived experiences of their parents, because that's their truth and that's their reality, and that's important, and value that for the students so that they know that they're not going against their parents when they're trying a variety of things and not taking that specific biomed track or whatever it is, and exploring things, right? So I don't know the answer to it, but kind of just keeping in mind that it's very complex, and from a student, I think sometimes from a student standpoint, it puts them in a position where it creates a lot of pressure and anxiety without the school site really being aware of it, without the parents really being aware of it. And so just building that in, I guess. I don't know if I was clear about that, but in speaking with students, I really felt like that was something that really resonated with me, that was something that I didn't understand, and it wasn't my lived experience, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, I guess.
Any more other comments? But yes, that describes it perfectly, Laura. We want to value everyone's, right, their own culture and heritage and stuff, but knowing that might be adding, right, to the students' anxiety and maybe a little bit of the stress level. Okay.
Yeah, and I think also, we've been talking about like setting up a structure to give our students the skills so that they graduate with that social and emotional literacy, so that they know how to figure out or discover ways to self-cope, right? To be able to manage the stress. And that's a big component of this, which I know was a big part of the presentation. That I think that's a key tool that we can give our students as they graduate.
Yeah, I don't think I hear what Laura's saying, and it's true. I don't think it has to be an either or as far as the, what the family values are, and things have to be honored. I think what we're trying to do is give our students the tools they need to navigate all that, to be able to manage their stress levels while, hearing and accepting what their families want for them and the success they want them to have versus where they are and the pressures that they feel. It's really about helping them to navigate those pressures and manage their stress. I think that's what we're trying to get to, because it's important for all of our students to be able to navigate these things now, because as they move on to college and beyond, those are going to exponentially probably increase in different ways, and it's these tools that are the most important.
Yeah, and actually navigating, exactly. The coping mechanism, it's not even academic, right? It could be academic, but it, like this pandemic, right? Like, how do we go? So as a whole person, to not just the whole student, it will help them if we can help with giving them some of these, coping skills, coping mechanism, again, going towards learning more, right, about different things besides academics.
Yeah, and I think that, with that Venn diagram that was shown at the beginning with the overlap of learning and social and emotional wellness, I think as we start to develop further and enrich the learning style so that it goes beyond assessment and goes to, fulfillment or whatever, where it becomes, then that starts to kind of shift the way that the way that families and students and parents and everyone kind of grabs onto that achievement and that number on your SAT or that GPA, and starts to look at it more like, what is the value of what I'm learning? It's not just in a score or a number, it's in the love of it, right? And so kind of shifting that just that philosophy, so that then I think that will also help to relieve some of the pressure of that SAT score or that application for college, or that, and make it more about, you can still achieve and you want to achieve, but it transcends that and it becomes so much more than that. And so then you can start to feel that value, and it transcends it, right? It just makes it more than just a single number.
Anything else? If not, I guess we can move on. Dr. Malloy?
Sounds like, I think it would be good for us to move forward, and then we'll have time at the end to continue going deeper with some of the concepts.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to now talk about some assessments of social emotional well-being. The first thing we're going to look at is our own student wellness survey, which for the first ever, we gave a wellness survey. It was brief, 6 to 7 questions to all students in the district. And part of what we wanted to do with that is, one, we wanted to check in with kids. We wanted to, if kids reported more concerns, we wanted to reach out to them individually, and also to really connect with the students, give them an adult connection. And this was really what this was mostly about, is that we're connecting with our students. We let them know that we see them and that we're here to support them and to help them. The staff, the support staff and teachers and admin across the district did an amazing job in administering this and in following up and checking in with students as well. The other piece of data that we're going to be looking at is the California Healthy Kids Survey. And this is administered once a year or once every other year. And it's from the CDE, and it's designed to help districts be able to foster supportive and healthy climates for students, to help them with the students learning social emotional competencies, and then to help decrease the risk of at-risk behavior for students. Next slide. So this is a slide from some of the questions, the elementary student wellness survey. And you can see we had some statements, and then students said whether always, often, almost always, never, or sometimes agreed with these statements. So TK1, that was given by the teachers. They interviewed the students, and then grades 2 through 5 were through a survey format. So for example, in the first statement, I share my feeling family at home. 19% of TK and 1 students say never or sometimes. 26.8% of second graders said that, and 29.4% of 3rd through 5th graders indicated that. There were a couple key statements here that really we focused on, and that the sites are really focusing on in terms of supporting students. We asked TK1, my classmates like me, and we asked grades 3 through 5, I have friends that I can talk to. So you can see 14.5% TK and 1 students said they never or only sometimes have friends to talk to. 22.7% of second grade, and then grades 3 through 5 was 21.4%. So the school sites reached out to individual students if they showed concerns in specific areas, and also the school sites are looking at some of those things in a bigger picture. So if 19.3% of their 3rd through 5th graders are saying they can't get help from their teacher if they need it, what is it that we need to be doing differently at our school site and our classroom so that they know that they can get help from our teachers? One of the other pieces we looked at with 3rd through 5th grade is I am able to handle stressful things. And 32.4% of 3rd through 5th graders felt that they are not able to handle stressful things. And we look at that as, where's the learning opportunity there? How can we be teaching them to handle stressful things? What are the social emotional learning and other pieces of things that we could do to help our students be able to feel more like they can handle stressful things? Next slide. This is the secondary survey. So grades 6 through 12 completed the same survey. This students answered in a different direction. So most of these questions were posed as how much this is stressing, concerning you. So that it's almost always an often, but it's just because the questions were asked in a different way. So 44.3% of our students are missing peer and social interactions. And that's not surprising given our current circumstance. But definitely, as we look at that, particularly for students that are staying remotely and not coming back in person, how are we making sure that we can create those social interactions for students in different and unique ways? Students indicated that they had a high level of stress. 32.1% of students said they're concerned with their own level of stress, and 21.3% students said they're having trouble coping with their current situation. And then 8.4% of students noted that they're stressed by the workload at school. And so there's further conversation at sites about how we can help students manage that stress and really look closely at what the workload is for our students. And these are a few slides from the California Healthy Kids Survey. So the first area is student connectedness. There's a few questions that are involved in this. So it asks students, do you feel close to people at school? Do you feel safe? Are you happy at school? Do you feel a part of your school? And do you feel that teachers are treating you students fairly? So you see that we have had some increases since 2016-17 through to 2018 and 2019. But generally, when you look across, we haven't, over 3 years, we haven't changed a lot in terms of our percentage of students who indicated that they were or often feeling connected to their school. So we have about 22% of 5th graders that indicated they do not feel connected to school overall. And 41% of 11th graders in 2019 and 20 indicated they did not feel very connected to their school. Next slide. This is another area from the California Healthy Kids Survey, and it's about caring adult relationships. What they ask students about is, do adults at school care about you? Do they listen to what you have to say? And do they make an effort to get to know you? Those were the questions that fell into this category. So you can do every grade growth since 2016-17, but we still have quite a few students that are not feeling that they have caring adult relationships at school. So about 25% of 5th graders indicated they did not feel that they had caring adult relationships at school, and about 42% of 9th graders indicated that they did not feel that they had caring relationships at school. So while we have some areas that are higher, we definitely have some more work to do in these areas. Slide. And this is a question which they asked 5th graders, 7th graders, 9th graders, and 11th graders is, in the last 12 months, have you experienced chronic sadness or hopelessness? And you can see every year we've had increases in that for every grade level. So it gets higher. More students report experiencing chronic sadness and hopelessness as they get older, but also within every grade level, we've had increases from year to year. So about 41% of 11th graders are saying in the last 12 months, they've experienced feelings of chronic sadness and hopelessness. And about 15% of 5th graders are saying that in the last 12 months, they've felt that way. So what are some of the trends and the things that we're seeing based on the data? So we see that a significant percentage of our students across grade levels indicate they're experiencing stress. And not only do they indicate they're experiencing stress, they're telling us they're struggling to manage it and struggling to cope. The level of connection that students feel to school decreases the older they get, And we're also seeing increased levels of chronic sadness over time for our students. And then when we look at some next steps and how we look at this, and you referenced this in your conversation, often we talk about social emotional well-being as a thing we do or a service that we provide, and we don't look at we look at things in isolated parts and not as integrated across the whole system and integrated in terms of all of the learning they do and all of our work. So, we really want to look at that and change that. We want to look at how that can be part of a whole system and how supporting the sense and purpose and belonging for students is part of our culture and embedded in all that we do. Thank you. I am going to pass to Debbie Pettish, our Director of Curriculum and Instruction.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy and Jessica, for that amazing presentation. So we are now going to turn to the concept of deep learning, which we have been talking about in the district for a little while. But what do we mean by learning? So it is a term defined in the educational world. It is evidence-based. And really, it's a term that talks about a specific type of pedagogy. And by pedagogy, what we really mean is how we as educators approach the teaching and learning of our students. And of course, that means strategies, right? What strategies do we use in the classroom to support student learning? But it's really important to also talk about like our underlying belief system and what that means in terms of how it is, what the implications, that underlying belief system has for the strategies that we use, and also how we view how students learn. Okay, so it's a very important concept. So it really focuses on needing to really support students in developing complex understandings and meanings rather than focusing on the learning of superficial knowledge. So when we dig a little bit more deeply into it, what are the students doing? What does the instruction look like? So students really are striving to go beyond a basic understanding. So we really want to support students in developing an in-depth understanding where they have the ability to apply knowledge and skills into a new authentic setting. And so we know that we have so much more information, and we talk about this all the time, right? There's so much information literally at our fingertips that we can access. So how do we support students in potentially accessing that information, but then going deeper with it in order to develop really an understanding that they can carry with them throughout their education and hopefully life? Second, students are engaged in their own learning. So this idea of engagement is extremely important. Students need to be able to ask questions. We all know that our kids, whether we're talking about our elementary students, our middle school students, our high school students, they are curious about the world. They have interests. So we want them to bring those into the classroom and build upon them. They're very, very motivating. So how can we support students in really asking questions about the world around them that they can then investigate, for example? How can we support them in constructing their own meaning of particular concepts? And then how can we, as we all know, collaboration, with our colleagues, with our peers, with our friends, with our family is so important. So how can we support this idea of collaborating with others in a really, really impactful way? This type of instruction also promotes high cognitive challenges. And so we want students to be able, for example, to have a data set, be able to analyze that data set, draw conclusions from that data, and then back up those conclusions with specific evidence from the data. Or figuring out complex solutions, maybe to a global issue, maybe to a local issue, and really kind of digging deep, working with others in order to come up with creative solutions. And then students are given opportunities to transfer and apply their knowledge to new authentic settings. So what this really means is, and this is really a sign that deep learning has occurred, that the student knows it in such a way that they're able to apply it in novel ways to really authentic things, right? And this next slide, we'll get a little bit more into that. We talk about innovation. So deep learning provides opportunities for students to be innovative. Again, they use their curiosity and interest to think more globally, to develop solutions to problems. And so the idea of innovation and deep learning are really intertwined, because through deep learning, students are able to be more innovative, okay? Which, of course, going back to what Dr. Malloy said in the beginning, is so important for their future success, whether we're talking about college or their workplace, right? Students have to be able to innovate. They have to be able to create something new. So what is that something new that they're creating? It depends, right? It could be an idea, it could be a product, it could be a process, it could be a service, etc. So that's a very important concept when we talk about deep learning. So this slide represents some strategies that are often used in traditional classrooms, like the ones that I grew up in, for example. And then on the right-hand column are some strategies that are really more emblematic of classrooms where really deep learning is at the center. But I really want to highlight here that there's room for pretty much everything that you see on this chart. And it also kind of goes back to what Rachel said. There's some teacher-driven experiences that our students absolutely have to have before they can get to the deep learning, right? There's some transmission of existing knowledge that has to occur before they can take it up to the next level. So we're not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but we are saying that more of a focus on deep learning is really needed for our students to be able to achieve in not only today's world, but especially the world of 10, 15, 20 years from now. So what are we talking about? Teacher-driven, of course, where the teacher is making a lot, if not all of the decisions about what's going on in the classroom, versus student-led. How can we hear more student voice about what they want to learn and then potentially how they want to learn that? Again, this idea of transmitting existing knowledge, so that I'm the teacher and I'm going to impart my knowledge on my students. And again, at times that is necessary, but how can we also then build upon that and work towards really connecting students to the real world, relevant, authentic problem solving? Learning is sometimes impersonal. So how can we really connect students in meaningful ways to their learning, through their interest, through their curiosity, through their voice? Technology, we offer technology for transmission, for consumption. We read an article, whatever it may be. But then how can we really use it as a connector and an amplifier? I kind of alluded to this earlier, but the student receiver of knowledge versus them really being able to engage in inquiry-oriented activities where they build their own understanding of that particular content area. And then compliance-oriented, and that's important that our students are compliant, of course, but we also want them to branch out a little bit in terms of building new relationships among learners, teachers, families, communities, etc. So, and again, I want to emphasize there's room for most of the things that you see, but there is a bit of a paradigm shift that we believe needs to happen towards deep learning in order for us to really create that type of graduate that we talked about earlier. And then also with deep learning, there's this concept of global competencies. And so you can see them here. Of course, character, critical thinking, collaboration, citizenship, creativity, communication. So in order to really live and be able to evolve in this changing world, students need to be able to have these competencies. They need to be able to collaborate with others in order to be successful. They need to be able to communicate well. And I want to say that I think something that's really important to emphasize is this idea that it is important to have these competencies. It's very important. But these competencies also support the student in understanding the content at a much deeper level, right? So if you can think critically about that math problem, then you're not only developing the competency of critical thinking, you're also really understanding math at a deeper level. Collaboration, right? I mean, how important is it for all of us to really truly collaborate on a project in order for us to create the absolute best project? So we're not only learning how to collaborate, we're also using that skill as really a tool to learn whatever content is contained within that project. And then I think sometimes it's hard to visualize, like, okay, I kind of get it in theory, but in practice, what does it really look like? So this is just a quick, about a 3-minute video that we would like you to watch. And it's very interesting. These kids are not high school kids. They're, I think they're upper elementary or lower middle school. And the way they talk about their learning is really amazing.
Enigma missions have changed in the way that they have begun influencing the classroom teachings in other ways. We have opened it up into the potential areas in literature circles.
These are books that somehow connected back to interdependence, and we wanted to enrich the students with these literature studies to just branch out and bring about new perspectives, new pathways of thinking.
I studied the book I Am Malala. She actually taught me, like, with one human being on this planet, you know, a lot of things can happen. Starting from my Enigma mission, as with mental health, I realized a lot of people are actually mentally ill. I wanted to do homelessness. This is what I'm actually confident in. I went down to a food bank. I talked with people and, you know, I had a normal conversations and I learned about their story. At the moment, I am creating a film which will have my voiceover of what we've done on the day. And my goal is to let people know how to help so I can encourage them.
The project I'm doing is an Enigma mission on space exploration. I actually went to an observatory and I learned a lot from the people there. I've really wanted to show the people at school what I've seen through the telescopes and just anything that I think is important that comes from NASA that people should know.
So many of the students had shifted dramatically from their previous thinking to this quite mature, very deep, very thoughtful way of seeing the world and themselves and others.
I read a book called The Hunger Games, and the main character is Katniss Everdeen. Her life is full of poverty and unfairness.
We had a live forum. So basically the live forum was about unfairness and democracy. And then I was thinking in my head, how can I change the world if something is unfair?
We came up with the idea of the Young Leaders Conference because we've been to the Leaders Conference before. After finding out the prices that they're going to make it next year, we thought it shouldn't be that expensive to be going to something so inspiring and something so important for people in their lives. If we can't do anything about it to change it, then we'll just create our own.
And the 6 C's are all highly connected and interwoven into this whole process. Character comes through actioning, through other people giving you observational reflections. Collaboration is the learning symposiums where they're constantly challenging each other. Creativity for me is the thinking processes. Critical thinking in everything.
I feel very complete. Like I feel like I've actually achieved something that, you know, that does mean a lot to me. And, you know, I'm just overwhelmed by all of the feelings that, you know, that I've experienced with the people and the school as well. Yeah.
The literature has become another layer in the journey. It's enriching, it's deepening, it's broadening the perspective, it's helping them to step into the shoes of other people's lives that they perhaps couldn't do before, and to share with one another, to be able to make meaning from all of that.
So the thing, many things struck me when I saw that video, but one of the things that struck me was how the students really capitalized on whatever their interest, their passion was. And then they really, really dug deep for information, like whether it was reading a text, going out into the community potentially, and doing some pretty creative things because they were so passionate and interested about that particular topic they chose. And then from there, they of course created projects and really were able to take the learning that they experienced, the learning when they dug into the information, when they went out. I think one individual talked about, doing some research at a food bank, et cetera. So to really like synthesize all of that information and then apply it to a unique set in order to, in these examples, solve a complex problem. So I'm hoping it gives us kind of a little bit more of a visual of what deep learning is, or at least could look like. So just moving on quickly, kind of a shift here to our academic indicators. And so we went over quite a bit of academic data at the board workshop last week when we focused on equity. And so those charts and graphs were for the most part looking at particular subgroups and the disparities that often existed in those subgroups. And so this is really just a summary of, again, what I think we all know. We know we're an exceptional district. We know that we are high performing. We know that we are one of the best in the state. And many of the numbers you see on this slide today, I think really indicate that, right? Nearly all of our students graduate. We have 81% of our students proficient on CASP in 2019. We have 77% of our students proficient on CASP in math in 2019. And we have 71% of our students who graduate college and career ready. So as you can see from this slide in particular, we are doing very well, right? But there's room for improvement. We're doing very well, but how do we take it to the next level so that we don't consistently have, for example, 20% of our students graduating without being proficient in English, which is what's happening, or 23% graduating not being proficient in math. So what we really want to do, and as Dr. Malloy talked about in the beginning, take what we're already doing. We have so many extremely successful endeavors that are happening across the district, TK-12, preschool 12. But then how can we really take those to the next level? And so piggybacking on what Amy and Jess talked about, this chart represents the Healthy Kids Survey, and it represents how our students indicated the extent to which they felt they were able to meaningfully participate in their education. And so the survey, that meaningful participation is an overall kind of umbrella term, and they asked several questions under it. And it was things like, I do interesting activities at school. I help decide things like class activities, or I help to decide things like rules in class or at school activities, right? And then I have a say in how things work. So you can see, like much of our data, this particular indicator trends down as students get older for the most part. And really, if you look very closely, it never in the last 3 years for any age group has gone above 50%. So that means consistently 50+% of our students, whether they're in 5th grade, 7th grade, 9th grade, or 11th grade, are feeling like they don't have opportunities to participate in school, in class, in meaningful ways. Okay. And I want to say, you know, we talked at the equity workshop, this idea of intention versus impact. I've worked very closely with our teachers for almost 10 years now, and that is the impact they're wanting to have, but that is the impact that the students are feeling. And then finally, deep learning and innovation trends. So as I just highlighted, the SRVUSD academic indicators, we're consistently high. We know that, but we are not meeting the needs of all of our students. And that is consistent over time. We also have standardized assessments that actually do provide us with what I feel is a very good overall once a year snapshot of how our students are doing on certain academic standards. It also does not assess some of those other qualities that we find really, really important that we talked about, like these global competencies. So if we feel like collaborating or communicating, you know, is really, really important, then how are we assessing the extent to which succeeding in those areas? So students often feel that they do not have opportunities to participate in meaningful ways. And then what impact does that have? So what deep learning tells us is that if students don't feel that they're part of the process, right? We talked earlier about providing them the ability to ask questions, to guide their learning based on their interests, curiosities, etc. So if they feel like they don't have opportunities to participate in meaningful ways, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to learn at really deep levels. So we wanted to stop and ask a question here. We also do have an opportunity at the end of the presentation, of course, to hear your thoughts and your input and your guidance. But this question is essentially like the SEL question, but just based on learning. So based on your knowledge, your experience with our community, the things that you hear, what do our students need from a learning standpoint?
Great, thank you, Debbie. Trying to view and make sure I'm capturing everyone, but just want to say I'll start before I can see in gallery mode. Here we go. No, the interest. I mean, I was struck by the video. It was great, right? And usually we think of what these kids. Students do are like, you know, older or a higher grade level. And I was like, wow, they're doing that as, like you said, either a higher elementary or maybe a lower middle school level. So that shows that, right, our students are able to do something a lot more, you know, maybe than we thought. And I think that the key, right, is that interest. Their true interest, which actually will drive not only, I think, engagement, right? We saw engagement, curiosity, but also motivation. Now, I know with my, my experience in working with teens, that it is, you know, I think the traditional model of education with classes and schedules and stuff, sometimes, unfortunately, you know, they need to learn certain things, but it kind of drives down the motivation. You know, when there are certain requirements, especially what I'm seeing is that a lot of our teenagers who used to be great voracious readers, right, are their motivation for reading decreases dramatically. And you know, it's not their fault. I'm sure they're still, you know, good readers and stuff. But I think that because there are certain required readings that and they're not interested in, right? Then they have to read that and they don't have time, especially given the statistics that we saw some data around, like, oh, I have a lot of schoolwork, so I have all this reading to do and I don't have time to develop and maintain, right, foster my love of reading that I had before. So that's just one example. And of course, not to all students, but I've been seeing a lot more students have said that to me. So yes, interest, built on curiosity, engagement, and motivation.
I just want to add to that because I appreciate those comments so much, because my own experience with my son is that I've watched him over the years in his academic process. And when he's interested in something, he will do amazing things. I mean, he started his own business. He has his own car club. He's doing all these things because these are the things that he loves and that he's passionate about. I think where the challenge comes in education for sure is that there's a foundation that he needs to have academically to be able to succeed and to be able to go to college and get his degree and get out there in the world. And it's like, how do we engage these kids like him who don't fit the traditional academic rubrics or box to get them excited about learning? Because, for example, with him, math was the bane of his existence and mine pretty much through the whole time he's been in school. So how do we give a perspective to those kids, or give the tools, or engage them in a different way than we have been, so that they can also be successful? Now, he may never love math, but in order for him to get to be proficient at it, which is the goal, and we're talking about academics here, how do we do that? Because for kids like him, especially those who have learning differences, which he had also, and some ADD thrown in, how do we help them be successful? We have all the services that we provide, and that helped him tremendously. But I see that there's a huge difference in amount of energy and engagement that happens between the things that a student is truly interested in and the things that they're not. And I think that's our challenge, is to be able to engage them.
Rachel.
I think an important point to add on to that is that interest doesn't just come out of thin air. Mm-hmm. We can't just have our kids go through things and just expect them to have interest in anything, right? They need exposure first. And in a community like ours, where there is more opportunity for field trips and for travel on vacations, and our kids have lots of opportunities to be enriched that perhaps kids in other communities don't have as much. But we have kids who don't have a lot of exposure either, because of whatever their family circumstances are. So we can't just assume that kids have interest and then go off on your way and develop interest, because if you don't have the interest and you don't have the skills, you're just stuck going, okay, there's nothing for me here. So I think there's a lot of stuff that I've read recently about that young children are interested and capable of exposure to meatier academic content, whether it's related to social studies, if you're talking about math, to build upon what Shelley was talking about. If you can make math relevant, I mean, how many times did you hear your kids go, why do I need to know this? Why, who needs this? So all of the subjects that we're exposing them to and the skills we're developing them for them, helping them develop, we have to be showing them the why do I need to know this? How do you apply it? I think a lot of my oldest was severely learning disabled, but to hear him talk about the math that he's learned on the job working in construction, I've had conversations with Gregory about this. It's just, when you now show someone how you use fractions and why you need to know them because you're building something and you need those tolerances to be right, it makes it so much more meaningful. And so I think it's that infusion of meaning and why and just exposure to the world that will help build those interests. And we don't need to wait until middle school to start exposing kids to to the content. You can start younger, and it can come through their literature, of course, bringing in choice. So, I mean, I think this is a really hot button in terms of how you plant the seeds for deep learning.
Well, and especially, I mean, I remember when my girl's 4 years old, right? At 4 years old, that's when that why? And I think that we can start from there on. And I totally agree that I think the why, why is it meaningful? Why am I learning this, right? It goes to explaining and capturing maybe and exposing the interest. And I also agree that I no longer actually with my own students use the word passion, because we don't all, suddenly are born with a passion. It's developed. And
but you also have to give kids the scaffolding. Like a lot of times we throw kids into the scientific method, come up with a hypothesis. Well, if you don't have enough to even think about there to create the hypotheses, you're sticking this kid in this kind of impossible situation where they start making stuff up. And so the idea that these constructivist ideas are great, but they can be taken too far when because you don't need or want or expect kids to create all of the science of history, on their own as a little one. You can expose them to pieces and then let them think about it and let it grow. So it's all about, I guess, proportion and scaffolding too.
Laura?
Yeah, and I also I agree with all of that. I think that connection and having having the context of what you're learning to be able to really get excited about it, I think has so much value for all age groups. In terms of like early intervention, the IEP process, those types of things, I feel like we need to make sure that we have I'm sure a strategy exists, but look at it, at how we can really put a lot of energy into that early intervention, so that we're not then categorizing kids, so that then they kind of end up on a certain path. And I think sometimes, from what I've seen with the IEP process, is that it's designations don't necessarily happen until 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. And so there's already been those learning patterns in the specific student, frustrations in the student, in the family, that then kind of put them in a mindset where they're just not ever going to be able to learn, or math is really hard, or that kind of a thing. And so looking at I don't know the answer, but just really kind of paying attention to how a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old kind of sees that the way they learn is okay. And so now let's give them the support and the tools so that then they can learn the way that they learn, and they're not forced into a situation perhaps where they're they have to take the resource class in middle school, and then they lose out on things, and now they're that student, that kind of a thing. And I know that there's a lot of work around the IEP process and around, I know that we're doing the work. It's just, how do we now kind of transcend it and really look at the little kids to be able to set up a framework for them, so that they don't have to, so that a percentage of them don't necessarily have to go into that IEP process because of a loss of interest, rather than a difference in the way, in their, I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? So that there isn't that like category that they end up in, I guess. And I'm speaking a little bit without really knowing a lot about it. So, but I just want to kind of put that early intervention IEP pathway process on the radar. And then also with collaboration, I know from, and this is just my own experience with my kids, that there's a frustration when it comes to like a group project type of situation, where where there is that opportunity for collaboration, and it makes a lot of sense for that collaboration. But I think sometimes you don't perhaps the kids don't necessarily get true authentic collaboration, because what it comes down to is one student doing one part and another student doing another part, or, you know, one student doing more of the work because it's their grade, and then another student not feeling like they can really collaborate, you know. So like looking at those projects, helping to set up a framework so that those projects can really be collaborative. And maybe that doesn't mean that they're learning how to collaborate in a project. Maybe that means that they're learning how to collaborate in other ways, so then they can practice collaboration in the project. But, you know, looking at that, not just talking about collaboration, but looking at ways to really make it authentic and about generating ideas, and about, you know, as opposed to just about doing the assignment and getting the grade type of thing.
President Ordway, if I could just jump in and just do a time check. There still is another piece, and we do need the board members' time at the end. So it doesn't mean that I'm signing comments. I just wanted to offer that because we do have to end at 3 to return to our board meeting, the continuation from the other.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ken, go ahead, and then
yeah, I'll try to keep my comments short. What came down to me, and I'll start with Deb. I really appreciated your discussion of the traditional versus deep learning, and particularly I think it's important for people to recognize the interaction of those, and not that they're mutually exclusive, because I think a lot of folks would initially sense, okay, we're taking this and putting that aside, and now it's only this. And I think it's really important to make sure that we've found that interconnection. One of the things through the different conversations that we're having here, or the comments, one of the things that really hits me is, and it's nothing new, but it's the importance of the role of the teacher, the individual teacher. When we talk about motivation of kids, I think we also need to consider the motivation of our teachers to evolve in their practices. And that's not to say that everyone has to evolve. It says that we all are at different places, where we may have some who are fully traditional and others on the other end of that spectrum. But when I think about it, as I was watching the video and listening to your comments, what really hit me was that individual student who, and we talked about passion and things like that, but the one who is so much into sports statistics that level of math surpasses anything. They know not just numbers, but the application of those numbers and things like fantasy leagues and things of that nature. Or the kid who can pull, even with today's cars, can pull apart an engine and put it back together. Or the kid who's just a virtuoso in the arts. And the question I have is, how do we take those motivations and relate them to the educational aspects that we're trying to get them into? And so, you know, to me, that's where it comes down to the individual role of the teacher, to be able to recognize that students come with those kind of capabilities, even when they don't express it well in the math course, the math test, or the English course, the English test, and figuring out how to make those connections. So a couple of thoughts I had. First was, when we talked about healthy surveys for kids, a question, because I don't know, do our staff take those surveys as well, to be able to recognize where they believe what they believe our kids are thinking in terms of their level of safety, for instance, or level of interest, and those type of things, so that we can actually help our staff members recognize that there might be some disconnection between what we believe as adults, where we think our kids are because of the high grades and the high graduation rates and all, as opposed to how the kids are actually feeling. So I think that's one possibility. If we're not already doing that, it might be interesting for adults to take that assessment as how they view their students, what they believe are their students, not themselves, but how they believe their students would react to these questions. The other thing that I know we don't do quite as much as other school districts, and it's a different level of motivation, but I think in terms of career pathways, that other school districts really, you know, particularly in more underserved communities, use a lot of the career pathways as a way of motivating kids to actually even show up for school. But there might be some need for us to consider a stronger view of that for our kids who may not be as academically focused, however, do have tremendous interest in an area. And the question is how well we've prepared them to be successful in that particular area. You know, we don't do auto mechanics the way we used to do auto mechanics or shop or those type of things. But how do we prepare kids who really would be a fantastic plumber, electrician, you know, something of that nature. And again, in our community, people don't normally think of our community producing plumbers and electricians, but that's where our kids might be. And just making sure that we've really prepared them for success as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Anyone else or move on? Okay, Dr. Malloy.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm going to now turn it over to Chris George, who is going to talk about implications for future.
All right, thank you. We can throw the presentation up on the screen. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me, trustees. My name is Christopher George. I'm one of the directors of instruction here today, and I get to talk about the implications of all this for the future work that we're going to do. We have talked about some big ideas in the last two workshops. We've talked about changing the way we look at equity for the modern world. We've talked about a pedagogy that really could revolutionize the way our classrooms look and really change the way we look at learning as a whole. We've talked about giving social emotional learning the place it deserves in our curriculum and in our school system. But we've got to talk about how we're going to make that all work together. And a little bit of that today is, what I'm here to discuss is a curriculum and instruction framework that hopefully gives us some ideas of how to institute that, how to work it all together. We're going to do it in 4 categories. Nothing that we haven't seen before when it comes down to categories. There are categories and questions that we have a strong foundation in our district that we've been working on for years in many ways. We'll talk about standards and frameworks, and that's how it is. How do we know what we want? How do we want students to know and be able to do? What is it that we really want students to be able to do? Talked about that pedagogy. How do we teach that to foster that deep learning? The question of assessment has come up quite a few times today. How do we know when students learn it? And way more important than how do we know when students have learned things, how do they know when they've learned it? And how do they know where they are in a journey of learning so that they know what to do next? And then finally, how are we going to make good on our promise that 100% of our kids are able to access success in our district? How do we intervene and extend learning? How do we implement intervention systems so that when we know what do we do when kids don't learn a topic or a standard? And then what do we do when they do? How do we extend and enrich their learning? Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. We're going to start with that first question. What is it that our kids to know, to be able to do? We're going to talk about 2 things, and I want to pause before we get to this part of it because we talk about the other 3 a lot. We talk a lot about pedagogy. We talk a lot about grading and assessment. We're doing that a lot this semester with our district, and that's really what kids talk about at the kitchen table, is that grading and assessment piece. And we spend a lot of time on MTSS and RTI and intervention theory and practice. But we have to kind of turn to putting as much energy into describing and being able to understand what our standards and our frameworks are as much as we put into those other 3 areas. For our purposes, standards are, we want kids to know at a given point in time, standards, 3rd grade standards, 5th grade standards, geometry standards that you can look up and read. And you'll see they're what kids to be considered a successful third grader, this is what they should know. Frameworks are more blueprints of how to put that plan into time, how to put that plan into action over time. We have standards and frameworks coming at us from all angles, next generation science standards. We have specific standards for English learners, instructional frameworks emerging from state, social emotional learning standards and skills that we're talking about today. And finally, those global competencies that we described under deep learning. Those are things we want kids to know and be able to do. So just some recommendations and things to think about what we need to do with that area of learning. We want to remain, personalization. We want to remain the district that kids have the choice and the option. A lot of what Trustee Mintz was just saying not 3 minutes ago. We want students to have choice regarding courses and programs. If students who want accelerated math pathways, we want that available to them. Students who want the great CTE pathways that we have, the biomed, auto shop, we want that available to them. What we don't want is a differentiation in quality. We want to make sure that those programs are quality no matter what school they're at across the board in our district. And that's what we need to work towards through the second piece, which is articulating our district-wide essential standards. The idea of a guaranteed viable curriculum that exists, that surely we need to have, and it's a long haul, it's a 2 to 3 year conversation to really agree on what it is that we want our kids to have across the district. And that's, what is it that we want our graduates to graduate with, what skills? And we're having that conversation through deep learning and what it is at the end of a year of Algebra 2. What are those agreed upon standards? And then, what do we want at third grade? On at the end of a unit, just really articulating and agreeing what it is that we want our kids to learn, whether that's social emotional skills, global competencies, or tried and true academic standards. That's the piece of that. Then we move to making sure that those are clear to kids. The third part of that is that clarity of essential standards. We can have all the standards in the world and they can be great and well written and theoretical and high level standards, but if our kids don't understand them, they don't do us any, they don't help us intervene, and they don't help us make good on the promise that 100% of our kids will succeed. So Deb already went over the deep learning pedagogy and what it is, but in order to implement it correctly, we just wanted to talk about 3 areas. The professional development that's necessary in order to implement the deep learning strategies and the pedagogy. We need to engage all of our staff in the learning across the district on deep learning pedagogies. What is it? How do they do it? As with any methodology, pedagogy implementation, we've got to support the staff with the materials they need. We've got to provide them with the tools, the resources, and the materials support the deep learning of standards. That goes back to last week's equity conversation when we talk about a diversified curriculum to represent our student body. It's resources such as technology to make sure that we've met the need that this transformational time in education needs. And it goes so far as the learning management system that we're selecting this year to go forward, making sure that supports deep learning standards. Finally, nurturing that district culture that believes that all students can and will engage in the deep learning and that all students can and will achieve at high levels. It's a culture of collective responsibility, and it's on all of us to really grasp that we believe that our kids can and will learn the deep learning at the high levels. It's mirrors much of what we talked about with equity, that we can no longer look at learning as an opportunity that we provided, and if an external factor prevented a kid from accessing it, well, then that's too bad. It's now on us to remove the barriers to equity and to learning and to social emotional health, and to take responsibility for removing those barriers. So the third part of this, and this came up a lot when we were earlier talking about social emotional learning and student stress and how we are assessing kids and what that's doing and not doing for our kids. But we are doing a lot of work around this semester, formative, accurate, and meaningful assessment practices. I want to talk a little bit about why it is that we spend so much time talking about and trying to these formative assessment practices. The first part is the main part, is that if we say something matters, we have to measure it, and we have to be able to tell our kids, are you close to getting there? Are you there? What do you need to do in order to get there? if that's a academic standard, or if that's global citizenship, or if that's, character, we have to be able to describe to our kids, this is what we want, and this is where you are on that journey towards getting there. Formative assessment practices allow us to identify for intervention so that we're not leaving any kid behind, so that we know, as we talked about earlier this semester with universal screening, that we want to make sure that we're catching every kid and every standard and everything we can do to make sure that all of our kids meet the standards that we do have. They allow us to evaluate our own effectiveness. There's nothing more frustrating than running programs that don't work and teaching in ways that don't work, and not getting what we need out of our own work and our kids, and formative assessment allow us to do that. It enables student agency in the learning process. If you work with Don Hattie's Visible Learning, he talks about how self-assessment and having kids involved in their own assessment is one of the most efficacious things that we can do in order to further kids' understanding of learning and to bring that deep learning to them. Finally, it's the equity piece of assessment. Equity and assessment have a huge relationship. And when our assessments are more accurate, more meaningful, more formative, it brings an equity piece to the classroom that's been missing before. That when assessment has had more to do with where a kid comes from, or what supports were already in place for that child, there's inequities there that we need to resolve. So the bottom line with the assessment and grading piece that we need to work on is we need to shift from the idea that assessment is a summative judgment on performance yesterday to assessment is a formative tool to assist learning tomorrow. Traditional world summative judgment assessment is us grading on compliance and behaviors. It's overusing standardized testing. Deb talked about that earlier, about how we're so reliant on standardized testing data, snapshot in time. It doesn't do what we need to do as far as telling us what we can do tomorrow. We drive towards grades as punishments and reward systems. I mean, we all came from that system. And finally, and this gets to the heart of what we were discussing about a half an hour ago, which is that those grades end up being the driver of stress for kids. That is an untenable situation that we've discussed for years that we have to get away from. Somebody much wiser than I once said that students don't stress for learning. Little kids going out and learning something in their backyard aren't stressed out about it. Kids stress out about grades and not learning. And we have to take that to heart. And the way to do that is to really turn our culture to assessment being a formative tool to assist learning. What is that? That's a reliance on qualitative feedback, talking to kids about what it is that they've worked on, talking to students about, how can we make this better, encompassing well-being and academics, talking to students about how they are today as a form of formative assessment in their mental health and well-being. It's about relying on feedback over points, feedback that informs them. And it's about making assessment motivational, accurate, and meaningful. The piece of that, we talk a lot about using data in our district. We've got to just look at how we do that and become more adept at using data at 3 levels. And, we look at the sky high and the middle and the ground level. We've got to look at data from a district level that, when we look at trends and systemic inequities, we've got to look at it at a site level to be able to say site by site what programs are really strong where, so that we can replicate them. We've got to look at, sites need to be able to set up systemic interventions by using their site-wide data and really say these are what our kids need help with, and this is what programs we're going to put in place to make that happen. The third piece is really the most important, though, when it comes to data. We talk about by needs so much, and that's knowing individual student data, knowing every student's progress on individual standards in order to implement targeted intervention and extension, to say we know what that kid needs, what that student needs, whether that's intervention, help, extension, and enrichment. We need to be able to look at data at that level as well. Okay. The emerging themes from assessment, really talking about where do we go with assessment in order to make that educational culture shift from summative judgment to formative tool. It's about professional learning and community discussion. That's an effort we started this semester. All secondary staff is engaged in professional learning around assessment and making it more about formative than about summative judgment. We're having 2 parent nights where we're thrilled to bring our parents into the conversation on April 13th and April 19th, where our parents will join that conversation about how to make our assessments more formative rather than summative. Again, we've got to use and analyze that data as we just talked about. And we've really got to look at how can we assess kids authentically. Earlier, Dr. Malloy talked about the transfer and application of knowledge. We need to work on how we assess kids that mirrors that reflects that. You know, it's the classic example of, if I were to teach you how to build a house, you know, and came back in a year and said I was going to assess that skill, the best way to assess it wouldn't be to have you take a test on it. It would be to have you build a house. And we need to work on that authentic assessment piece throughout our district, especially as we transfer to deep learning, because it's really the assessment that's going to allow us to measure that deep learning and to have kids perform deep learning tasks. Thanks. We finally look at the last piece, prevention and extension of learning. What do we kids don't meet the standards? How do we make good on that promise that 100% of our kids, you know, are meeting the standards, meeting everything we want from them, social emotional standards, whether that's global competencies or academic standards. Again, just got to make sure that these 3 tiers are in place, that every kid has access to essential grade level standards for all students. That's tier 1, classroom, great classroom instruction, which, you know, we thankfully have throughout this district. Tier 2, the additional time and support for students to learn the essential standard current grade levels. You know, how do we use that student support time to provide that for kids? And third, tier 3, that, you know, that idea of tier 3, but the intensive remediation and standards not learned in prior grade levels. The themes that emerge around intervention and extension, really just making sure we're implementing MTSS tiered intervention systems. That's, you know, the work we're doing with, we have MTSS symposia, professional learning symposia throughout this semester, and going forward, really systematizing how we're going to use our student support time. This year was the first time, one of the opportunities of this pandemic has been that this is the first time that we had uniform schedules, and all of our schools had that student support time engaged in it. Thank you. You know, and now we've got to learn how to use that together better to make sure that we're using it for both intervention, extension in a systemized way so that all kids are getting it. And finally, just continually monitoring the progress of our students. We've talked about universal screening and what that enables us to do, but just continually monitoring how kids are doing in order to make sure that our programs are effective and that we're effectively reaching every kid. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Malloy.
Thank you so much, Chris. And again, everything that we've spoken about this afternoon, I come back to the slide that I had earlier in the presentation. It's about developing and nurturing the shared leadership throughout our system, and in particular, those who hold formal positions to create conditions so that the system directions actually are supporting the important improvement work in school. So the next slide takes us to basically the 2 important ending pieces, which are any final thoughts from you? What has resonated? Any questions that you still have, even if we aren't able to answer them today? If there's any, and I think this is the most important question, which is, what is it you want to be sure we ask our stakeholders? So this is going to be the last slide at this point. We have about 15 minutes for this discussion. So, you know, what do you think that we should ensure our stakeholder engagement includes or asks? And President Ordway, I'm going to turn that back to you so we can take the last 15 minutes to offer any insights along these lines. And I'll just need about 20 seconds at the end just to provide a remark. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, George, for taking us through the assessment, because that's an important part, right? And measuring, like, how do we know if our students are learning what we would like them to learn, or that they should, or, you know, and for me, I just want to, because it just kind of struck me while you were presenting, Chris, that I'm so glad that we're, you know, looking at the way we assess, and that we should move from, you know, traditional summative, right, assessment to more of a formative one, because again, the first one, the summative, is more of a judgment, and it's interesting because students, I think, they take a lot of self-identity, right? That they form the judgment on themselves sometimes when depending on their grades, and I think that goes again, right, crossing the line back into like the social emotional, which kind of again works through their curiosity and motivation in order to, you know, learn, and their mindset about learning and everything that everyone here has presented today is actually building upon it itself. So love the graphic in the, that Venn diagram type thing in the beginning. So that's my thought as the last presentation ended. Comments from other board members, or I'm gonna have to think about, take a couple of minutes to think about what we would want to ask our other stakeholders.
I would want to know from our teachers and staff that are in the classroom, when presented with the material that we just saw from Chris George, which was a great job, by the way, what tools do they need? What would help them to be successful in implementing the kind of thinking and maybe the shift that we want to see as far as our assessment and grading of our students? Because I think it starts in the classroom, and some of the assumptions that students make about themselves are based on the system that they're in. And if that system changes, how do we support our staff in being able to implement that? Because they're in the trenches, they're with the kids every day, day in and day out. So I would want to know from them what supports they need, and also looking at what is the cost for us to be able to give them those tools, looking at it further. Once they tell us what that is, then how do we go about trying to get them what they need? Also, some of the stuff around assessments and the system and the way that students look at themselves, again, as Ken alluded to, around the social emotional piece, comes from family. So I think we need to delve into what our parents are thinking as far as what they would like to see and how the effect of the system that we have has on their children, and what changes they think would be beneficial. Because again, other than the teachers, they're the other huge piece of this equation as far as how our students are progressing and how they feel about themselves.
Laura?
Yeah, and to tag on from Shelley, also asking, talking to our students and asking them what excites them about school, what they connect with, how they experience, their learning experience, and how they experience the assessments, and how that makes them feel, and just speaking with them about all of this and making sure that they really have a connection to what we're talking about, because they're the end user.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Oh, Ken.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm not sure if this is so far outside. It makes me think of Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, when he talks about, all of the students are above average in Lake Wobegon. And here in the San Ramon Valley, we'd like to believe we're like that all of our students are above average. Well, if you're going to look at average, that's not the case. And at the same time, I think we have the ability for actually all of our students to be above average, that we have a socioeconomic environment and a learning environment here in the Valley that gives every student the opportunity to be successful if we support them to do it. And I think that the programs that we're laying out can absolutely do that. But I think that from a stakeholder type perspective, I think we need to be able to measure the level of support that's going to be necessary, first in terms of acceptance of direction, but also to do whatever is necessary, whether it is a teacher in a classroom to evolve their practices, or parents who are willing to sometimes even take a step back from pressure on their students, and other times to support the direction that we're going. I think it's also important for us to couch our planning in such a way that someone doesn't see, and I don't mean this as derogatory as it might sound, but just turning the system over to the kids by saying, oh, okay, what do you want to learn? How do you want to learn? Well, it's not that new age. It's incorporating what their needs are and being adults in terms of structuring the programs and providing the guidelines and parameters for them to be able to learn. So I've used often the analogy of, when you're trying to make a decision or go a direction, it's not usually just one straight line like this. It's usually, within parameters, and within those parameters is a whole lot of room to grow. What you want to do is make sure no one's heading back the other way. And I think that's where our assessment process fits in. I like the idea, and I'll put it in my own words, of, our assessment processes being value added, that it's, that there is some reason for every assessment we do. And to make it clear to our stakeholders as we're talking about it, to make sure they understand that whatever level of assessment, we're doing it for purpose, that it's not just because, well, yeah, we want to do a test or something. And it's important for the kids to understand too. And one question that does come up for me is when we talk about global competencies, how do we, and the importance of them, how do we actually go about measuring our success in transference of those global competencies to our students? How does that fit into the assessment process, so that we're not just thinking, okay, we gave them a project to do so. Now, of course, they know more than they did before, but is there a way of actually measuring the success that we bring to collaboration skills? So it's not, as was mentioned earlier, just, well, yeah, collaboration isn't really collaborations. It's one kid who's doing all of the work because they know the other kids are going to hurt their grade if they don't. When I do mock interviews with kids, it's actually one of the questions I always ask is, if you're in a situation where you're in a group project, which is more and more common these days, what do you do when your colleagues, students or otherwise, aren't holding up their end? How do you deal with those kind of situations? And so finding ways of communicating that to our kids about collaborative work, and again, other competencies and what it means to them to be successful. Anyway, just some random thoughts. And I think that sharing these kind of things with our stakeholders to make sure that they're aligned with our direction, and that it doesn't come across to folks as, well, this is new age stuff. This is, this is this year's new math kind of thing. That it really is the next step in an evolution of successful teaching and learning for our students here, so they can be successful going forward.
Rachel?
First, I want to say thank you. I think this presentation today was really, really good, really deep, really thorough. I think one of the challenges as we take this out to get stakeholder feedback is going to be first communicating the, vision's the wrong word, but like the big picture of what we're hoping to do, and then get feedback on kind of like the how, maybe also some of the what, but more on the how. And I think, Ken, some of the points you just made a moment ago about this isn't about measuring ourselves to look good or individual kids to look good. The whole point is that you're getting kids ready for the world in the context of what we talked about in the beginning, to be productive, fulfilled, interested citizens, right, for life. And so how you do on a test is really not a very important part of that. It's can you do the whatever it is related to the standards. So I think the parts of the presentation that Chris went through are going to be really important for our stakeholders to understand, because I think a lot of times people just look at assessment as a way to measure a student, or often how to measure a system, right? And the gotcha, and that you're either doing well or you're not, or look how you're failing, instead of the feedback loop that assessment really is intended to provide. What do you need to do better? What do you need to do differently? How do you need to reach out to kids differently? So touching on the other point Ken made about this isn't just handing it over to the kids for what you want, it's it's getting the kids' input on how do we meet your needs better? How do we serve you better? It's not just, what do you want to learn about, right? So I think for this process to be productive for the district, but also for the stakeholders to not feel like they're just wasting their time, is for there to be kind of a differentiation of what is the information being shared, and then what is the feedback that we're getting from the stakeholders as their educational system in the Valley.
Yeah, no, it's want to tag along, yeah, with both what Ken and Rachel had said. It's kind of hard, right? I mean, the quantitative, right, elements that we measure, those are easy, like with the grades and certain numbers and stuff. It's qualitative, and a lot of the global competency skills, right, goes into the qualitative, and how do we measure some of critical thinking and collaboration and things that you kind of brought up. And I think it'll be interesting to know what our stakeholders, both teachers and staff and parents, because I think the first point, right, on the assessment was like measure what matters. So be interesting to know what matters to our stakeholders too, given the context of all this that we're talking about, and what's good for the student as they move ahead through our district and beyond. So any other comments, questions?
I wanted to kind of add one thing about the assessment, grades, numbers, those kinds of quantitative, numbers and benchmarks. As a parent, as much as I, in a perfect world, dream about grades not mattering, I admit that grades matter to me, right? Like I have a battle with one of my kids all the time, and he, and it's like, you just need to do the work to get the grade so that you can just that kind of thing. And so with that in mind, and knowing that that's in my mind, to ask our parents what it is that will satisfy them and make them feel okay that their kids are learning what they need to learn. Because right now, what makes me as a parent feel okay is that grade, right? And that's partly because that's the information that I get. And in the last couple of years with School Loop and that kind of constant, and now even Google Classroom and checking in, and you constantly are looking at that grade for what happened the day before kind of a thing. And so that's kind of in the world that we as parents are sitting right now. 10 years ago, we weren't sitting there, but now we are. So knowing that that's the starting place that we have to start at in terms of making that paradigm shift to how we look at assessments, informative assessment, rather than the summative, you know what I'm saying? So that it is just, it's going to be hard. There's going to be a learning curve, and it's going to make parents and students, I think, and teachers, everyone really uncomfortable to have to look at things other than the ABC, how am I going to get into college if I don't, if they're not testing me on, on I don't know, whatever, on a standardized testing for, math, and how are they going to know where I stand in the line, and how am I going to know where I stand in that line of getting into that school? So anyway, it just, from a parent perspective, just being aware that it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, totally get it. Actually, right now, that's the stress level for students and parents. It's going on right now, just like what you said, Laura. I mean, when colleges and universities are saying, okay, we're test optional. What does that mean? Right? So yeah, so some of that unfortunately is coming from externally, but yeah, how we may perhaps help our students and families understand maybe some of these skills actually transcend the standardized testing. Rachel.
Laura, I'm so glad you said that, and that you said it the way you said it, because that is exactly what the parent stakeholder subcommittee of the grade reform committee has been working with for like the last, what do you think, Chris? Probably 6 weeks building the presentation. So this is the perfect time for the commercial for please come to the April 13th and April 19th session, because we're going to dig into all of this, and hopefully by coming to those nights, people can be brought along in the process and be reassured and to learn as they go, and to maybe reduce some of that stress level. Because you're right, we all grew up with grades, and so it's like, it's hard to imagine, well, how else do you do it, right? And so thanks.
Okay, any other comments, reflections, insights? Okay, Dr. Malloy, back to you.
Thank you so much, President Ordway. Thank you to our board members for your engagement today. Thank you to our district team and all of the people in our schools who gave us the insights and perspectives that we share with you today. I think that the conversation that's happened over the last couple of hours, and that is hard to capture, as Rachel, you suggested, but we will try to provide high-level overview to our community and to our stakeholders regarding where we wish to move and why, realizing that our next steps will be informed by their insights that we bring back to you. So we will now take all of the insights and perspectives. We will incorporate that into our stakeholder engagement. We look forward to our community's involvement, and then we will be back before you in May. And as you see there, President Ordway, in the chat, we do need to ask if there are any public comments before we end this part of our meeting and move back into, I know we are in a workshop, but we have the additional agenda item that is from the other night. So thanks again to our board members for this discussion today.
Okay, great, thank you. And so I ask Logan, do we have any public comment on our strategic direction workshop?
There are no hands raised in the audience right now, but I will remind attendees, if you have a public comment, please raise your hand now.
While we're waiting one moment to see if anyone raised their hand, I'll just point out that today's case count has gone to 6.9 per 100,000.
Yay.
Yay.
Finally.
No public comment.
No public comment. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so before, yeah, I have a request. Before we move on to our, back to our 8.1 item, we're gonna take like just a couple of minutes of break. So we can, yeah, do our business, and then we'll be right back. Thanks. Okay, great. I think I see everyone back. So, okay, I'm going to move on now to 8.1 item that was moved from our last board meeting. And this is the review of considerations, timeline, and progress regarding racial equality response, I believe, to the petition that we had received.
Yeah, so I can go ahead and share my
Okay, thanks.
screen. Yeah, sorry about that. All righty, hopefully you can all see that. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here today to, as a representative of the Ed Services team, to talk about the racial equity petition. So essentially, as you know, there has been a petition, an equity petition, circulating in our community, and we believe for the last 2 or 3 months. And so far, at least as of a couple days ago, it has been signed by about 1,500 students, staff, parents, and community members. So at the February board meeting, I'm sure you recall several individuals who I think either had a hand in creating it or had signed it, were passionate about it, did come to speak about the petition. And really talked a lot about their beliefs that we needed to focus more on equity work in the district. So more specifically, the petition called on the board to, and I quote, devote extra time, resources, and personnel to address both crises in tandem. And by the crises, they meant the pandemic as well as systemic racism. And then quote, the district must also support and listen to students, especially students of color, as the drivers and agents of change. We demand that the board take action on the following priorities. And there were 7 priorities, and you can see 4 of them here. And so essentially they demanded that we conduct a review of district standards and curriculum in order to increase representation of BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and to reduce dominance of white European perspectives. They also asked us to educate students on racism, microaggressions, and racial class privilege. Increase the percentage of staff of color. Mandate bias training for all staff and the Board of Education. They demanded we formally acknowledge the Indigenous histories of the lands in which our school and district offices sit. To also divert money currently spent on school resource officers or SROs to other forms of support such as counselors, and then to commit to taking action on at least half of these priorities by the end of the 2020-2021 school year. So if individuals have not watched the March 2nd board meeting, we really strongly encourage you to do so. This was the meeting that really outlined the process for which the district will create a strategic plan. And one of our 3 components, and really if you also watched the one earlier, earlier today, excuse me, equity really serves as the foundation for our district plan. And of course, our district plan is going to guide district work for the next 3 to 5 years, and not just at the district level, but at the site level as well. And many of the items from the petition were integrated into our presentation on March 2nd. And so when we were formulating the presentation, we consulted the equity petition several times in order to kind of better understand what individuals were asking for. And much of it meshed very well with the discussions that we had been having internally, really based on the data, quantitative, qualitative, anecdotal, that we had been hearing. So for example, we're suggesting an equity curriculum audit be conducted in order to analyze and diversify our curriculum. And of course, this is something that the writers of the petition had requested as well. So you can see the themes that are emerging, all of the themes that emerged from all of the equity analysis that we did for the March 2nd board meeting. So some of the themes are diversify curriculum, equity-based professional development for all staff, and curriculum for all students, leading to greater accountability, effective and consistent responses to discrimination and hate, recruit and retain a more diverse staff, and then an increased focus on system-wide practices. So one of the big themes that really came out of the March 2nd strategic planning discussion that focused on equity was this idea that we needed to do more as a system, and that much of our work over the last several years have been focused on individuals and the work of individuals. And that has been very powerful in many ways because we've built really a contingent of leaders across the sites, classified, educated teachers, counselors, administrators, who can lead much of this work. But with that being said, we really need to take a step up and look at system-wide practices that are leading to the inequities that were really highlighted on March 2nd. Excuse me. So we do intend on, and I realize we have stakeholder engagement, but these are in at least the initial iteration of the strategic plan. And these are things that we as a district really value, and based on the Board of Education's comments, I don't want to speak for you all, but really value as well. So we wanted to say it's not just about the strategic planning, that we have been doing the work this year in terms of building a foundation for the work that's ahead of us. So one of the things that has been occurring is, as part of our climate and culture committee, there's a subcommittee that's been working all year on working specifically on how to diversify TK through 12 curriculum. So they've been looking at, how other districts are doing it, what kinds of tools they would use, just basically before embarking on that journey, really trying to educate ourselves on what that would look like. So this committee has been looking at that. And it consists of a wide range of people. There's students, there's staff, there's parents, there's general education staff, and then there's special education staff. Of course, due to the Board of Education, who approved the Ethnic Studies course, we will be adding that to all of the high schools starting this upcoming fall. So all 4 of our comprehensive high schools, as well as our alternative school venture, will have Ethnic Studies class on the books. We also, and I really give a lot of credit to our Human Resources Department, we analyze the diversity of our certificated staff in comparison to our student body. And so they spent time really looking at the current year's data, as well as data over the last several years. They cut it several ways. It actually wasn't just certificated staff. We looked at classified staff, et cetera. And then based on the information we gathered on our student body, we compare, the percentage, for example, of Asian teachers, the percentage of Asian students that we have in our district. And they've also, the Human Resources Department for recruitment. So each year, of course, they have recruitment fairs that they go to. They've really been trying to branch out, and attend these fairs in areas that might have a more diverse population than we have. And then finally, we need to identify and reach out to diverse groups of stakeholders for input on the strategic plan. So what you saw on the initial page, what were emerging themes for the strategic plan. We now need to go out to our stakeholders, and I love how the board put this a couple of days ago, which is we need to cast a wide net, but we also need to cast a targeted net. And that's exactly what we intend on doing. with our community in order to get input on, all the components of the strategic plan, but equity as the foundation is particularly important. And then there's a couple other things that I also wanted to highlight that are not on this slide. We have, one of the things that they requested was for us to on a consistent basis really pay tribute that this district was built on lands of Indigenous peoples. And so a member of our Culture and Climate Subcommittee actually reached out to an elder who was part of the Native American community. And she asked them about this practice, right? Like, what does this really mean? What is Native Americans? What is your take on that as an elder? And this individual said that it's really appropriate to only verbalize that particular thing at meetings, right? It's one thing to verbalize that we're on Indigenous lands. It's another thing to actually commit to supporting the Native American community. And this elder said that, at least based on one point of view, so we need to do additional research, but that it wasn't really appropriate just to verbalize something. You have to accompany that with actually action, showing that you're committed to this work by doing something. And then we also looked at the student resource officers and the cost of those over the course of a year. And what we learned is, because of our, relationships with the San Ramon and Danville police departments, that even if we took the salaries of all 4 of our high school SROs, it would still, we added all of those up, we would only be able to hire a part-time counselor that would cover all 4 schools. So ultimately, really, we are not charged a tremendous amount to have those SROs on our campuses. So even if we got rid of them, it wouldn't really probably provide the level of counseling or social work support that people maybe thought that it did. So we just wanted to bring that to you and to really recognize that the board, clearly through the strategic planning process, and us as a district, we are very committed to providing, obviously equitable outcomes. It's not just about opportunities and access, but really what are those outcomes for our students and for our teachers? And that is something that we are absolutely committed to. And we appreciated, learning more about how passionate our community was about this topic. That's it.
So President Ordway, I think this brings at least an end to the staff presentation. Again, this is not, when I say the end of the staff presentation, the end of the work. It's actually the beginning of the work. That is not actually accurate enough. It's a continuation of the work. But what our initial strategic direction conversation has stated is that we do need to go deeper. It can't just be about words. It actually has to be about actions, but it also has to be about how we reflect on our systems and structures, how we provide professional learning, but also how we ensure accountability. So there are a number of key pieces that we are already discussing. You would have remembered that from our first portion of the workshop. And again, we are, as Debbie so clearly stated, hoping to get further insights from those who participated in this petition, as well as beyond to other stakeholders through the next process related to the strategic plan, and take already existing commitments, initiatives, activities, and ensure that through this next step, we make our work that much more intentional, inclusive, equitable, and in a particular way, pay close attention to those in our community who may have experienced greater harm. And I think that's important to note, because not everyone in our community would experience this discussion in the same way. And we need to acknowledge that. And the other thing that I think is really important in terms of the work that we're doing, we had our petitioners provide their voice. Staff is providing a response, but as I'm listening to us, I don't want us in any way to be communicating that we know and understand all the voices, all of the experiences who may not be represented here right now. And I think it's always a danger when we, in essence, are tasked with providing these insights and perspectives, which we can do. And Debbie, you did a really effective and clear job of doing so. But I also want to name that as well, because it's one of those very important dynamics that we have to balance properly. As we are reporting on the work that has happened, we're also acknowledging the voices that we've heard. We're acknowledging that we may have many other voices that have not become a part of this discussion yet. And that has to be incorporated in terms of our equity work as we confront all issues of racism, discrimination of all kinds, and so forth. So we'll stop there. And President Ordway, I will give this back to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for, yes, the presentation and then and the different points, right, of what the our community and the petitioners actually have been asking and what actually we've been doing in the district. And I concur with both Deb and Dr. Malloy that this is just a starting point, right? This work is it's a continuation, it doesn't stop. And I do appreciate that, you know, I think reporting back, right? So again, talking from earlier, this assessment, how do we know how well we're doing and things like that? So we've got to remember that, mindful that we need to talk about this and bring this back up, you know, once in a while and say, hey, how are we doing? You know, we've done this, our strategic work, some of the actual tactical, right, activities and things that at the site level, at district level, our system, whatever, you know, how are these changes going? And do we need to adjust what we're doing still? So I think that periodically we need to keep coming back to this. And it's not just one conversation right now because we're looking at a strategic, you know, direction, but we gotta keep the conversation going. So any other questions or comments from board members? Ken?
Yeah, this is actually the second meeting I'm having today that deals with equity, diversity, and inclusion. I chaired the East Bay Leadership Council, and it was quite a conversation we had this morning in steps that we're taking as an organization there, as well as the overall business community. I just want to ask first, before I make any more comment, Susanna, do you want to check on public comment first before you bring it to us?
Oh, sure, of course. Yes, so let me see. Logan, right? Yes. Logan, is there a public comment on this particular item?
All attendees, if you would like to comment on this agenda item, please raise your hand.
Do we have, oh, so we have a public comment? Is that what I hear, that little bell? If there is, I just want to remind that maximum time is three minutes for the public comment and only on this agenda item, please.
And Logan, I think you've gone on.
Mr. Arata, would you like to comment? Mr. Arata, we promoted you, so you can unmute if you would like to make a public comment. Okay, no public comment.
Okay. Okay, then.
If I can
All
go
right,
ahead.
then come right back at you, Ken.
Okay, well, my point was going to be that, you know, in our society right now, there is a lot of discussion going on about equity, whether it's from our environment here in the school district to businesses across the country. I know AT&T and other companies like AAA, PG&E, had a conversation with someone from financial institution this morning. You know, everyone's looking at the same thing. And one of the interesting questions we had was not even, you know, in hiring practices, for instance, or adding members. How do you even ask an organization, you know, to provide a member that might be from a protected class, for instance? So trying to diversify employment practices and others. I think the key, though, is that it's not about talking about it, it's about action. And I think that the conversation we had at our workshop for our strategic plan and the work that the district has already been doing demonstrates that we have been very action oriented in this area. Not to say that we're there, but to say that we're in a process of continuous improvement. I think one of the key things, and I believe we talked about this at our workshop, was, you know, when we have an incident at a school of that involves racial disparity, that it's not just about the consequence to the offender, but what we do with the victim to make sure that they are, you know, feel that there's been resolution within the confines that we can for confidentiality and whatnot, but to make sure that particularly in a school environment, that these are teaching opportunities, as unfortunately sometimes they occur. The one other thing I wanted to address very quickly is the question of SROs. I appreciate the point about you know, how far the money goes, because we don't really pay for the SROs, the city and the town do. And that represents a very key relationship that we have with the police departments. I think from the community, it's important to understand the value that the SROs bring to our schools, as well as to support not only the high schools, but support we see at the middle schools. There's a reason why our valley, San Ramon, Danville, are considered a couple of the safest communities in the entire state of California. And I think part of that is the relationship that organizations like the schools have built with the local police department in a way that is relationship building with our students. It isn't a gotcha type experience. It really is a support within our school community where they can feel confident being around our police, recognizing that they are public safety officers that are there to support them. And if there's ever an incident where we saw otherwise, we would definitely want to know that. We would want to work with the cities and the police departments on that. But to my experience over the years, it has been very, very supportive and an important aspect of the police getting to know the students, but more importantly, for our students to understand and appreciate the role that our local police and public safety officials provide. So I can just say as one school board member, I definitely appreciate the support that we receive from our SOOs and our local police departments. And even if it was something that we were putting dollars towards as a school district, it's something I'd want to make sure that the community understood the value that they bring to us that makes it worthwhile, particularly here, compared to what you might hear in other communities. That's it.
I just want to tag on to that because I totally concur about the SROs. I have a lot of personal experience at the high school level for 4 years with the SRO program at San Ramon Valley High School. And while I think we need to make sure that any SRO that comes into our schools are properly trained, because that takes a certain kind of person to work with teenagers and with kids that age. and that they have relationship building skills with the campus and the kids, because that's what I saw at the high school. And I think they were actually a positive influence on our campus. And I think it is important for the kids to have a perspective about the police department, and the SRO is like an ambassador of that to the campuses. That being said, I know there are other places where there have been really horrible experiences with SROs in other schools and other school districts. That's not something that I have experienced at San Ramon or in our district, but we work closely with the Danville Police Department, and they've always been very supportive. When we do grad nights and things like that, they're always coming by to make sure we're okay, that nobody's bothering us, that the kids are safe. So I would want to continue that because I think it's been a positive thing. I'm looking forward to getting more in the trenches with this and getting more information about, you know, what additional resources we can put towards implementing some of the things that we're looking at, getting more stakeholder, more voices to be heard, more stakeholder activity on it, and looking into what programs we can use to, some of which we have done in the past, like No Place for Hate, and programs like that that have a profound effect on the way that our kids interact with each other and understand one another. And I think that's a huge piece of educating our whole community about other races, about other, whether it's, you know, ethnic, whether it's sexual, whether it's whatever, gender, whatever it is. And so I look forward to hearing more about how we're going to implement all of this and what the input is going to be from our community.
Laura?
In regards to SROs, I want to say first that I also believe that there is definitely a place for SROs on our campuses. They keep our campuses safe. They make me feel safer, with that my kids are safer in terms of from any kind of violent threats. They also build relationships between police and students, which is very valuable, and they educate our staff for active shooter training and whatnot. But I also think that we need to really look through the lens of some of our marginalized students and how they feel about SROs. We don't spend a lot of money on it, and that's great. And I feel that we should continue to keep our SROs, but we need to look at the dynamic that's being created with SROs, review the data, look at you know, the discipline policy outcomes in relation to race, in relation to culture, in relation to mental health. And then also start to develop some implemental strategy around the equity in the power dynamic between discipline, between an SRO or any other, you know, any other adult that's providing discipline with a student that maybe wouldn't necessarily have an adult like a parent in the same way that other students have to come up and say, you know, create that power dynamic, create that leveling of power dynamics so that the student has an advocate in their corner when there is disciplinary action happening. I think if we look at the data and that tells us that there is more discipline happening to marginalized students due to their race or whatever it is, and seeing that, and then making sure that we're really supporting and creating a leveling of that power dynamic, using restorative justice, really looking at accountability, and not just looking at the accountability of a student that doesn't necessarily have the adult to rattle the cage around them, I guess. So I think that there's more to the equation than just, should we have SROs on campus or not? I think we need to look at how an individual student perceives that SRO and how we can build a structure and a support around that so that there is more safety, both, you know, for all students, but also for individual students, if that makes sense.
Rachel?
So Laura, I'm glad you brought that up the way you did, because I was thinking the same thoughts. I was kind of surprised that that particular item was included on the petition from our community, because I have mostly heard about very positive relationships between students and our SROs. But I like the way you said it. We need to explore if there's another story there that, you know, only affected a few students, but it was significant. So I think even though we're not spending a lot of money on it because the town and the city help us out, just, you know, kind of the motivation of why that was included in the petition needs to be explored. Or is it that in the whole Black Lives Matter movement, is that a key topic? Is that why it got into the petition? So, and I'm not at all ruling it out. I'm just saying, I think we need to explore why was it included in there?
Yeah, and do you mind? I can kind of reflect on that a little bit. So, because during my campaign, that was a big triggering topic that we had during the debate, and I did a lot of outreach afterwards, and I spoke with a variety of people, including our SROs and our police department, as well as some staff on campus and some students, and specifically some Black students, and their experiences. And there is no no generalized experience. Everyone has different experiences, and there are students on our high school campuses that feel uncomfortable around SROs, and also that have been in situations where they're not comfortable speaking out or up against how they feel. And I had a really good conversation with a staff member at Cal, and she talked to me about that power dynamic. And I see that too, because I know if my child did something and got in trouble, I would rush to school, and I would do everything I can to make sure that, yes, that they were accountable, but also to make sure that it didn't, that I mean, I hate to say this, but I wouldn't want it to then affect the rest of their life, right? I wouldn't want it to then there would be something on their report, on their file that said that they had done this and that, and try to kind of make it so that it was okay for them. And I think there are some students in our community that don't have that safety net just personally with their family. And so to make sure that there is someone that's saying, wait, is suspension really what needs to happen in this situation? If an adult wasn't there, would it just be, well, this is just the easiest thing to do? And I don't want to, I say that, and I don't want to discount the hard work that our staff and our counselors do, but I just feel like there are those stories happening, and we really need to look into that and make sure that there is that equity within that. So
well, thanks for interrupting and including that you had done that additional research. Of course, we all know there's certain offenses that are mandatory suspensions, and there's that whole process. But I think just knowing that there are particular students that don't get a sense of security, get a sense of threat by having uniformed officers on the campus, that is worth exploring. Kind of shifting topics though, I feel like this petition put several claims positions forward, and they explicitly asked for us to deal with at least half of them by a given date. I just want to make sure that whatever response we're giving is responsive. It sounds like we're already working on more than half of them, but I think we need to be clear that we're being responsive and give them the feedback that assures them that they were heard and that it's being addressed, and in a personal familiarity with some of these things to know that they're being addressed well. There was one thing in the petition where it was related to staff training, and they included that they would like members of the Board of Education trained. And Deb, in what you shared, you said staff, but you didn't include the board. I would like to put it out there as a challenge to myself and my fellow board members that we say yes, us too, in terms of any training, because I just think it's super important that we are all on the same page as staff in terms of language and terminology and the plan. And so I would like to volunteer us to be included in the training as well.
Yeah.
Assuming you all are, I mean, I'm not going to make you, but I'm just requesting that we all say, yes, me too.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think that anyone on the board that has an objection to that. Because yeah, no, it's very important that we all, right? Because we all come with our own lens, but all of us have lens with bias. So yes.
And just having participated in the Courageous Conversations trainings that we've done a number of, they're really important, and important for us to understand the mind shifts that are there. In fact, that one homework assignment you do in that class, Susanna and I were at the same event that evening, and she was the person I interviewed, which was before she was on the board. But you have some aha moments in those kind of trainings, and I think board members need to experience them as well.
Okay, anyone else have comments?
Just one other quick question, point on the SROs, and I really do appreciate Laura's points about marginalized students and how they might feel about SROs. I think, though, that particular to our community, there's an opportunity to help change perspectives, given how our local police departments, and it was brought up, the way they man or staff those positions, as well as the approach that those SROs take. Of course, nothing's perfect, but I think there's a real opportunity to change the dynamic given the program we have in place, much more so than if we were to drop SROs and leave things status quo the way they are in other communities. Let me put it that way.
No,
So
I completely agree. I think that it's in the silence of it that then we're not learning. And if we talk about it, and I know from my conversations with one SRO in particular, I think Lieutenant Williams was her name, and that's what they want too. You know, it's like they want to build those relationships and make each and every student feel comfortable around them. And so how can we, use this as an opportunity to educate and to inform and to allow people to be able to speak their truth in a safe way, and not just assume that, well, because I'm comfortable with an SRO, you should be too. And of course we need SROs. Well, yeah, we do, but let's talk about how that's affecting each and every individual student, and then learn from it and build on it.
Yeah, I know, for instance, that the Danville Police Department feels a loss that with the COVID experience, they don't have their lunch with the cop program at middle school, where police officers have been known to, play basketball with the kids during recess and things like that. Again, just to build a humanness to the interaction.
Well, at San Ramon High School, our SRO, who was there for years and was pretty well loved by, I won't say all students, but most of the students, would have, lunchtime meetings with the kids where he'd invite them in and talk about what he does and in relationship to them. And I think things like that, where there can be more one-on-one with students who might trying to outreach to students who might be more uncomfortable, to try to help them understand what SROs are there for and what they do, would be helpful too.
If I could just offer President Ordway a comment that we can take back, assuming I have heard it correctly, and incorporate it in a response, is that right now you're speaking about the important topic of SROs, but you've also spoken about the concept of power dynamics. And I think what I've also heard is that even when we are doing our very best, or when following all requirements, regulations, or processes as they are defined, there may be some in our community who are impacted by that differently than we think, know, and understand. And if we haven't created conditions in order for that experience to be shared, we'll never hear about it. And it becomes more about the majority voice, which again, we understand that that's part of our culture. When we ask for what people think, and we oftentimes hear feedback and we get a majority voice. And that oftentimes is the reason we move in directions. Obviously, that's foundational to democratic process. And it's important to gain the wisdom from those who have that different perspective. And creating the conditions for that is really the work. And being influenced by those who have experienced what I'm talking about in difficult ways is what oftentimes can drive the transformation, as long as all of us are willing to participate. At the risk of sounding too philosophical, what I'm hearing is we could be talking about SROs, we could be talking about administrators or staff members in schools, we can be talking anytime and any place that there are power dynamics that just need to be considered. And in our response, I'm hearing from you that we need to ensure that we are committed to creating those spaces as we have been, but maybe we can be that much more intentional and that much more, intentional is the best word, so that we are always asking ourselves the question, who might we not have heard? How can we ensure we're hearing and responding? And who else might we partner who might be more trusted than we are? I said this the other night in relationship to a different topic, so that we can gain that rich insight. Because if someone has felt that they've been harmed by institutions, whether it's been intended or not, our asking for feedback might not gain any of that feedback. So we have to take it another level to say, who might have some of those important trust relationships that can assist us to get better, but can also provide us with the rich insights that come from members in our community that are looking to find that place and space to share. So I think that's what I'm hearing. And I just wanted to offer that to be sure that we're on the right page in relationship to the discussion you just had.
Yeah, no, from my perspective, that's perfect. That's exact, summary of what we've been talking about. And I'm glad you, Dr. Malloy, brought up, the philosophical thing, because I was thinking about the same thing. We were talking about SROs, but I'm thinking, well, there are certain students, I think, that might feel the same way with certain administrators, teachers, any adult on, or even, other students who, under those different power dynamics and stuff. So I think, yeah, perfect. I mean, taking it for SROs to maybe a wider lens too. Okay, any other reflections or insights or questions on this?
Just one other clarification. So what we can do is, on your behalf, is reach out to the organizers. I always like to have conversations as opposed to just writing responses. But again, also be willing to take what you've just heard from us and put that into writing in a fashion that may not be a PowerPoint presentation, but a formal response. And then an invitation to continue to engage us through some existing structures, some community structures, as well as our strategic process. And so both a human personal connection, as well as a formal response connection. That's what I'm taking from this, but I want to check that that's what you're hoping and asking for.
Yes, I see thumbs up, I see nods. So yes, I believe that's what we'd like for you to do. Okay, anything else? Okay, if not, then I'm going to adjourn this meeting, workshop, both.